jumping us at the bottom of the screen, which is interesting.
Oh, wow, you can.
Mm-hmm.
Hundred and 102.
Looks like the rate of people joining us is slowing down a little bit, so shall we get cracking?
Yeah, let's start. Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello, friends and colleagues. Welcome to Action on Teaching University English Online, hosted by the English Association and University English. So this event comes from a tweet from Caroline McGuinness from Salford saying, perhaps we should share good practice as we make our move online. And that's exactly what we're doing. This is a practical morning. It's focused on helping our online teaching. Now, some of us have got lots of experience of online teaching, some of us have none, but for all of us, we're here to learn, share knowledge and experience and improve our teaching for the good of our students. Okay, so there are rules. Speakers, stick to time. We'll warn you and then we'll mute you. Asking questions, please tag your questions as in the instructions, tag them either for a particular speaker, okay, or for general questions. We will harvest the general questions and use them in the session at the end. We have an online repository which we are developed, so please send anything in that you found useful to Becky Fisher at the English Association, and we'll be telling you her email address as we repeatedly as we go on through the day. So that repository is going to be a really effective online resource for us all. Okay, sticking to time, asking specified questions, repository. Right, let's work together.
Sorry, can I have one thing to say? Lots of people are saying hello on the chat, which is really lovely. But for questions, can you use the Q&A, because it's much easier for us to keep an eye on them. Okay, thank you very much.
Fantastic point. Q&A for questions, chat, and remember all those netiquette things. Right, let's work together. Our very first speaker is Andy Griffiths, who is a staff tutor in English at the Open University. Andy, take it away.
Hello, bear with me for a second while I share my screen again. Here we are. Hopefully that will go nicely, otherwise it will slightly undermine my efforts to sound expert in distance learning. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So what I'm going to say is a very little bit about the distance learning environment at the Open University and how that might be replicated to some extent at very short notice elsewhere. I've got experience of teaching in other places too, so I have a sense of how that might fit together. Then any time I've got left over at the end, I'll offer some reflections on online teaching. So here goes. I think at times in the conversations I've heard about moving very rapidly to online teaching, two separate things have kind of got merged together. So online teaching, the delivery of tuition events through some kind of online platform, whether that's an asynchronous forum or something like this Zoom conversation where you're face-to-face as far as you can be with your students. Adapting to that definitely requires some rethinking of pedagogical strategies, adapting resources and so on. But that seems to have been merged, to my mind at least, with a sense of distance learning more broadly, where students are accessing most or all of the elements of their degree course at a distance. So in order to deliver a really effective distance learning program, you need to think much more carefully about how you're putting together a learning environment, what context your online teaching events are actually fitting into and how the whole learning experience is going to work. So how do we do it at the OU? Students' learning is perhaps more carefully structured and I want to say closely managed in a way than it is in a conventional module. So students will follow a fairly detailed module website that guides them through the course week by week. And that will work hand in hand with quite extensive print and web materials. Those are fairly hefty peer-reviewed publications. And the print and web materials combined will perhaps provide most of the information that students might get from a lecture in the sort of traditional lecture plus 2-hour seminar model of teaching. But they go further than that as well. So students would expect to encounter activities within those books. Perhaps they would be invited to undertake a piece of close reading, make notes themselves, and then compare those notes to something that might be a little bit like a model answer at level 1, or for final year equivalent students, it might take the form of kind of much briefer points that we would have expected students to draw from that material. So the printed texts are not simply delivering information, they're also inviting engagement from students. And we're offering that material kind of digitally and in print format on most of our modules at the moment. The form it's taking is shifting actually a little bit as more resources, more scholarship becomes readily available online. So those are two important strands that help to keep students on track right through their modules. There are two more strands as well that fit into this. There's a combination of synchronous and asynchronous tuition and contact time. So students will be in tutor groups of approximately 20, probably like other places for seminars, and that each group will have a forum running for questions and answers to the tutor, for occasionally specific activities to run, posting a resource, developing a discussion. That will run throughout the module, in addition to any kind of specific synchronous events, of which there will be a number through the course. More at the moment, now that we can't run our face-to-face teaching either. Alongside those two strands of direct contact with students, tutors will also be offering some quite finely targeted interventions, telephone tutorials to address issues that are emerging from student work. It's possible to do that because the assessment strategy is designed with distance learning in mind. So students on our modules are usually 60 credits, which kind of creates a slightly different context, but students would expect to write perhaps 5 or 6 essays through the body of the module, which carry a relatively low weighting and on which they receive quite extensive feedback from their tutor, which will then inform any specific interventions, will shape teaching as the module goes on. Then perhaps 50% of the total mark for the module will depend on a final examination or a final piece of coursework on which they aren't going to get the same detail of feedback. So I suppose the challenge for today is, if any of that seems potentially useful, helpful, how does one replicate any of it before the end of September? So I have a few brief suggestions. If you have a module website, can you expand it? Can you deliver additional material there, link key resources into specific weeks? To some extent, I suspect people do this already. Could you, for example, link in a handful of articles that might otherwise be buried in a further reading list and add to each of those a paragraph suggesting how this might relate to the week's material? Something we've probably learned over the last 5 or 6 years with the OU is that we can't really simply equate 2 hours of online teaching time to 2 hours of face-to-face teaching time. It's very hard to cover the same amount of material. So it's a question of finding other ways to have that input to students, to direct their learning. done well, it can be a good way to promote independent learning. So something like the kind of activities I was outlining earlier. Some of the material that you might have delivered in a lecture in conventional circumstances, rewrite it as an introduction to that week of the module, post it on the website, include it in an extended module handbook. Is that a time warning I'm getting? I don't think I've been that long yet.
No.
Not yet. Okay, good. Think also about the kinds of student contact that you're seeking to replace as you move online. It occurs to me that there's always an awful lot of informal contact, conversations with students that go on at the start and end of classes, office hour conversations, and so on. If we're thinking in terms of just taking our lectures and seminars and moving those online, all of that seems to disappear. So how can that be replicated? Can you run a question and answer forum for students? Can you set online office hours each week? Can you even schedule in, perhaps even replacing some seminars, time to do one-to-one sessions with some of your students, all of your students potentially, depending on how big the groups you're working with. In any case, I think it's worth taking some time to think about how you can engage students in those informal conversations that you would do otherwise. The other big resource students are going to be missing is one another. All the conversations they will have had with one another about the material, about their challenges, well, do they have a space to have those conversations? Can you create a space for them to have those conversations? My experience in terms of trying to change assessment strategies on modules has been that this takes a very, very long time indeed, and probably isn't feasible by the start of teaching in the autumn. That may vary from place to place. But if you can't change the assessment strategy for a module, can you invite students to engage in other ways? Producing a learning journal, annotated bibliographies, a bi-weekly reflection or something that could be marked with a very light touch indeed, but would serve a diagnostic function. You can tell when someone is misreading, is going off track, is not actually engaging at all.
1 minute.
1 minute. Well, you'll be deprived of my reflections on online teaching. Just very briefly, at the start of my online teaching sessions, even after a number of years, always feel a little bit like a seance. You sit in a darkened room saying things like, "Can you hear me? Is there anybody out there?" and desperately hoping for a voice from across the void. Embrace that. The start will be a bit awkward. Take some time to break the ice. It will improve. Okay, I'll draw a halt there. If I get a chance in informal questions or whatever later, then I can reflect on online teaching more fully.
Thank you so much, Andy. And thank you for sticking to time. Really appreciate it. And I love the seance metaphor. Maybe we could come back to that. Our second speaker is Dr. Catriona Cooper, who is the Senior Fellow in History, Heritage and Media in the Department of History at Royal Holloway, University of London. Cat.
Hi. Sorry, slightly slow starting my video. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm hoping everyone can see that. I'm just going to start a timer so I can see
Thank you.
How much I'm over speaking. Okay, good morning and thank you for inviting me to speak. In addition to my role as a Senior Fellow in History, Heritage and Media, I'm also the incoming Director for the History E-degree at Royal Holloway, and my background lies in digital archaeology. In March, I was quickly brought in to support the School of Humanities in the immediate transition to online teaching, and then to consider how we might support staff in the coming year, academic year of 2020 to 2021. In the speedy 10 minutes, I'm going to try and run through the Royal Holloway's flexible offer and how we develop this for the School of Humanities, and reflect on some of the critical issues we've encountered as we try and roll this out. So the problem or the situation, I don't know how many people are from Royal Holloway, but for those of you who are not, we are a college that kind of sits as part of the University of London, and we're very much a campus university. A lot of our recruitment focuses on the theme of community. So when we're moving to online or blended learning, we have to find a way to balance a learning experience for students who are not generally being inclined towards a purely online curriculum, but we also obviously have to continue working within the restrictions of a pandemic. As such, we needed to find a way to successfully deliver online learning, but with a feeling of community and providing a 50% face-to-face experience. It also needs to balance a learning experience for students who will not be able to access campus either for some or all of that period of time. And actually the same applies to staff as well. And also offering learning materials for protected groups who may not also have the same access to sort of technological resources. We also have to provide parity across our different courses and disciplines. So students, for example, from the humanities would recognise the same learning experience as those in computer science and biology and so on. We're largely relying on these technologies. So Moodle is our virtual learning environment. It could be Blackboard for other people, or at York they just call it VLE. And in this transition, we're encouraging our staff to think of this beyond a repository. We're kind of thinking of it as the centre to our students' learning experience in place of the campus. MS Teams is our focus for live communication, Replay, Panopto for pre-recording lectures, but it also allows for editing and captioning, which is going to be really important moving forward from September, and PowerPoint as it allows for the narration of presentations. The college developed the following model that combines the pedagogy of online teaching within the framework of a campus community focused university. Each learning block or week is made up of this 7-step learning experience, and in humanities this is largely replacing modules which are usually delivered through a 2-hour seminar or 1-hour lecture / seminar approach. And it looks absolutely terrifying, I think you'll agree. Having seen this and just thought about how our staff was going to react, I broke this down again into a model that was more reflective, I think, of the humanities experience, but you'll notice I'm continuing to use the same language that I'd used in the 7-step process. I'm going to quickly touch on each of these steps and how they kind of relate back to a more normal teaching experience. So for an introduction and scene setting, we envisioned this as a short video backed up with the same information laid out in a MOOC, in the Moodle. This video will introduce the member of staff, the learning block, and how this aligns to modules, learning outcomes, and link to their assessment. It will then highlight what work the student is meant to do, so how they're going to access learning materials, when they're going to, what kind of seminar or later activity is going to be involved. And generally, in my head, I envisaged this as replacing that section at the beginning of any class, where you introduce the lecture or the subject for that day, and run through what you're expecting the students to do and ask for any questions. The next step, also I just wanted to reflect on the fact that we wanted this both as a video but also provided on the Moodle, and the video is to provide that kind of more human feel, so still reflecting on the fact that our college is very much about a community focus. So the learning materials, linking back into the learning materials, we're really expecting staff to be providing the reading lists here, so students have really directed readings for what they're expecting, so preparation for their seminars. But the biggest change here is we're really considering lectures as learning materials, not as an activity or a class. And this won't be delivered as a face-to-face experience. Then moving on to an activity or learning check and learning reflection. So hopefully the students will have consumed the learning materials, and we will then bring them back together to undertake some kind of activity for staff to ensure their understanding, but it's also the space where we can really still have that discursive seminar kind of experience. And this is the kind of bit where we also have that blended learning experience, so whether we'd see this, and actually the intention is for this to be a face-to-face on-campus experience, but obviously we also have to provide the same experience in an online setting for those who won't necessarily be able to access it. So that will often be via MS Teams or a Moodle discussion board, depending on what kind of interaction this is meant to be. Finally, moving on to the summary and reinforcement. Some modules will require an extra hour of live activity to ensure contact hours are reached, but also to bring the learning block to a close, we're encouraging staff to hold a discussion Q&A at the end of the block where students can reflect on their experience and the staff member can summarise the learning and link back to learning outcomes. Again, I had envisaged this as that section at the end of a lecture or the end of a week's learning. We ask for any questions both about the learning activity, but also make any recommendations about assignments, clarify anything students necessarily haven't understood, and put them in touch with sort of wider research that they could do if they're particularly interested. Issues and sort of conclusions. In general, I don't think this is that unattainable, but it is going to require an awful lot of work. And our particular issue has been around contact hours. Contact hours can only really be considered if they're a live event. Combining this with moving lectures to learning materials, e.g. so that they're pre-recorded, has really not been very popular. Both myself and the other e-champion for our school don't believe it's pedagogically that a live lecture is good practice, especially delivered online. This is for a variety of reasons, particularly that it adversely affects those from protected or disadvantaged groups for reasons of access to digital infrastructure. So here we're really talking about the digital divide, those with specific learning needs, whether that could be a visual impairment, hearing impairment, or possibly ADHD or ADD. Also, in general, concentration in an online setting is decreased, so it is a detriment to all students. Catching up on contact hours and ensuring understanding would be best undertaken via a discussion or QA section reflected in the summary exercise. So again, there will be more time potentially, and the staff, is going to require more working hours basically. And there's not really a lot we can do about that, unfortunately. The situation is this. Also, parity of learning experience. We need to ensure all staff are consistent with terminology and adherent to these changes, so students can see a similar learning experience being offered across disciplines, schools and college. To some extent also, while it's really exciting, there's so much possibility here, we also need to limit engagement with wider technologies, because just to ensure it's accessible to all staff and students, because you don't want to see students feeling really put out if one lecture's doing all sorts of whizzy, amazing, exciting things, but other staff don't necessarily have the same ability to engage with those things. And I'm early, so thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Katrin. That was really clear, and I hope we're going to share slides and so on the repository, and we may be able to email them to attendants too. Thank you very much, Kat. And you were early. Great timekeeping. Our next speaker is Benjamin Colbert. He's a reader in English literature at the University of Wolverhampton. Benjamin, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Bob. What I want to talk about today are VLA discussion activities. My title's top 10 tips for online design, but I think my title probably had better be 10 types of online design, and maybe the tips will come along as I go. The lockdown and the move to online or part online that we did in March was the 10th anniversary, as it turns out, of the publication of an English Subject Center report that I co-authored with Rosie Miles, who will be speaking next, and several other members of staff at the University of Wolverhampton, where we had already been experimenting in online learning and online VLE discussions, including working them into the assessment of our modules. Looking back at it now, it looks like to me that the online discussion in the English Studies report hasn't aged very much and is still relevant for the situation we're in now. What we were trying to do there was to create some real practical suggestions for designing discussion activities online, for moderating them, and also for assessing them. And those of us who are involved in this aren't really just treading water until we can get back into the classroom in a post-COVID environment. But I really think this kind of thing can transform what we do in really positive ways. So my 10 tips or 10 types of possible design features are all kind of appraisals of material that's in the guide itself, which will be in the resource bank for this session. This is low tech, so I'm giving you a holy island behind me in order to rest your eyes. First off is textual analysis. I mean, all VLEs have discussion boards and places for posting and responding, no matter what technology you're using. And really the basic building block for a discussion is textual analysis, as we would do in the classroom. But online, this means students would read a posted or assigned text and respond to or initiate discussion. These could be set texts in the module, or it could be students' own writing. A lot of this has to do with where you put it. I mean, it could be placed before a lecture, seminar session, a whole group session, in other words, to create more engagement with the reading, or you might put textual analysis ideas after the session for more reflection on the issues raised. But the key here is all discussion activities are about students posting, but it's not just that. They need to respond to their colleagues and develop a kind of conversation, and that's where the learning really takes place. The second type that we've talked about is group problem solving, where students work in small groups and collaborate on set tasks. They could be, for example, working on one smaller aspect of a larger problem, and then coming back to report to the whole class, the whole group. In the guide, we had an example all those years ago of a late medieval Viking workshop where the group problem solving was used for thinking about types of evidence, and small groups were sent off to look at linguistic or historical or archaeological types of evidence to evaluate them and then bring them back into the whole group to have a kind of debate about what types of evidence work best. The third type that I want to talk about is group writing, and this is where students build text together. We've used this to explore notions of form, register, style, or narrative point of view. And students, some of our students, we have had write sequels to novels in which we set them in different points of view, and then they write small bits exploring one of those aspects of technique. I use it also on a MA module on popular romanticism, where the student's main task is to produce an edited version of an unpublished romantic period text. And we use a wiki technology here to do a whole group activity exploring how to annotate, how to research annotations, where to put them, and all the kind of technical aspects of scholarly editing. So group writing has a lot of possibilities there. A fourth and related is peer assessment, where students discuss and critique each other's work. This is a creative writing staple, of course, and it's kind of reconfiguring in the classroom, in the virtual classroom, what often goes on in the writing workshop itself. But creative writers have sometimes reported to us that in this case, we don't need to use all technology all the time. Sometimes it's better for students to shut off the microphones and shut off the videos and just relate to each other textually. So I think one of my tips would be not all technologies, not all the time. A fifth, which I'm going to brush over fairly quickly, we might call structured response, where students post replies following set rules. Jilly Salmon talks about email games in one of her books on trying to get students to think about summarizing and writing précis. And the game would be starting with a 100-word passage and then trying to come up with a 50-word version of that, and then a 25 version of that, and then getting it down to keywords and things like that. I haven't used this much myself, but you can see perhaps some possibilities there for your own work. My sixth is perhaps more creative so far than all the rest, and this is what we call role play, where students assume personae and respond in character to a given situation. This is a kind of low-tech version of what Jerome McGann and others developed a long time ago called the Ivanhoe game. These types of virtual reality, immersive textual experiments. Yeah, and what we do with this is to get students to think about literature by thinking through it and applying what they're learning to other contexts. So, for example, in an 18th century module, we have a fancy dress party online set in 1785 in Chiswick House for Lord Burlington's friend, William Wilberforce. And the students are given a certain number of period-specific tasks. First, they need to come in character as one of the characters on the module, or perhaps an author. They need to bring a book that was in print by then as a gift for Wilberforce. And what do you bring an evangelical abolitionist? Those types of questions, especially if you're Roxana from Defoe. These are questions that students have to grapple with, and it's actually really productive in helping them consolidate the ideas that we've been studying on the module as a whole. Rosie's done some really great work on Victorian literature in terms of role play, and she may have a chance to talk about that. The seventh is open and closed database analysis. And here, students are searching the web or interrogating a particular database and responding to either your questions or initiating their own. On a Victorian module, I use this, for example, to get students to go off to the internet armed with keywords and develop a data bank of materials on the woman question. And there's, so they interrogate all those full text database, Hathi Trust, Internet Archive, Google Books, etc., and come back with these texts and then use them as a way of discussing with each other the wider parameters of the question and looking at some of the course texts as well. Similarly, in a kind of closed database approach, I do something where I send them off to look at the Morning Chronicle newspaper articles in the mid-19th century, which deal with labor and the poor. We don't look at the very well-known Mayhew stuff, but Mayhew had a partner named Angus Reach, who did all the manufacturing districts. And so students are actually involved in some real spade work and doing some primary research and reflecting on that. And they find that really exciting. We got some really great work out of that. The eighth item is related to the previous, a resource bank. And students develop resources related to texts or topic for further discussion. And a resource bank could consist of images or texts or timelines or web links or the women question texts that I mentioned previously. On an intro to poetry module, we create a resource bank of poetry performance in which students perform poetry from the anthologies. And so we get a really interesting collection by the end of the semester filled with student voices. The fourth, the ninth and almost last is cheating, because we've been talking about asynchronous, and this is kind of more synchronous. Incorporating live chat room or real-time activities into some of these things, where students chat in real time with each other or even with guests, because the technology, of course, allows us to invite guests from other institutions or perhaps other countries or classes from other countries. So the asynchronous part of this might be some advanced preparation, thinking about questions or topics or familiarizing oneself with the guest's work so that when the moment comes, students can ask questions, get into a discussion, etc. So I think that's a real possibility for the various technologies that we have. I haven't used yet, but it'd be great to try. And finally, blogging. Blogging would be where students post on set or shifting subjects in the matter of a weblog, more free form, working out problems, unlimited duration for this type of activity could happen over the entire course rather than a more specific time like many of the others are designed for, and can become a resource in its own right. In conclusion, in reality, most of the design items that I've been talking about draw on multiple features, and any of the above can be combined in creative ways to underpin larger or more complex research projects that might last the duration of the module or form a substantial part of its assessment. So let me stop there. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I think I'm under.
Just on. Thank you so much, Benjamin. The report that Benjamin mentions and also contains a text version of the ideas that he's mentioned, came from the English Subject Centre and will be on the, either is or will be on the repository by kind of tea time today. So we can also read through that too. The next speaker was also involved in that report, which I really urge you. It's full of fantastic ideas. The next speaker is Rosie Miles, who is former reader in English literature and pedagogy at Wolverhampton and a National Teaching Fellow. Rosie, take it away. Hello, Rosie. Okay, we seem to have lost Rosie. Or perhaps it's me who's lost, like in a seance. Okay, unless we get Rosie fairly soon. All right. Oh, Rosie, there you are. You're on.
Hello, am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're unmuted. I can hear you. Go.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
You can, thank you. Sorry about that, folks. Let's just get this going. Thanks very much. Yes, as has been said, I am also was involved in the project that was work with the English Subject Centre. I'm going to talk a little bit about assessment, which some of you may throw up your hands in horror and think, how on earth can I assess anything? And bear with me. Even if you can't or don't intend to in the short term, I want to sort of offer some thoughts in relation to that.
Rosie, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. We can't see, we can see you, but we can't see your PowerPoint.
Okay. Okay. Bob, I'm wondering whether someone else should go ahead and I try and get this back.
Got it. So thank you, Rosie, for being flexible. Andrea, I can see you're up next, so I'm going to ask you to step in if that's okay, Andrea. Is that all right?
Yes, that's fine. Can you hear me?
Andrea is a principal lecturer in stylistics and student experience at Oxford Brookes, and is stepping in. Go, Andrea.
Okay, can you confirm that you can hear me, please?
I can hear you and I can see your screen.
Excellent. So, hi everyone. I'll be talking about digital accessibility and economic accessibility relative to online learning. I'll talk through some of the implications of these accessibility issues in general and for our discipline specifically, and just share some workarounds and good practice. The various areas of our discipline may feel the impact of some of these accessibility issues slightly differently due to some of the differences between what we do in terms of learning materials and learning objectives and the sort of standard learning modes, but most issues are shared across our discipline due to our kind of shared focus on text as at the heart of what we do. So starting with digital accessibility, this has become a phrase used in relation to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are a set of internationally recognised guidelines and design principles through which organisations should make all of their digital content accessible to people with impairments to their vision, hearing, mobility, and thinking and understanding. UK universities are required to meet these accessibility standards from September 2020 and or make a good case for explaining why they can't. But obeying the government aside, it's really pretty much just good practice. Because, for example, around 10% of people in the UK have some degree of dyslexia, and between 5 and 10% of the population have some form of colour blindness. So here are some of the things that we can do to help people access our learning materials more easily and to help assistive technologies such as screen readers convert our materials more accurately, including recognising all content and reading it in the correct order. For documents, use inbuilt style, so heading 1, heading 2, they're selectable from top ribbons in Word, for example. Use these for all headings so that they're recognizable as headings. To emphasize text, use bold. Don't use italics or color or underline or all caps, because these are less readable for people with dyslexia. Use headers and footers and include page numbers. Use a minimum font size 12 and make sure it's sans serif, so something like Arial or Calibri. Avoid coloured text, especially red and green, because they're the most common areas of colour deficiency and colour blindness. And ensure, if you have to use colour, ensure there's a high contrast between text and background. Align text to the left and don't justify it. And make sure you provide resources in multiple formats, by which I mean an editable Word document that students can format according to their needs, and a static PDF, which is more accessible to screen readers. For presentation slides, some of the things around font in the previous list still apply, but for visual content, provide alternative text for images, charts, diagrams, and that kind of thing. Avoid overcrowding, so leave space around your content. And try to use a narrow colour scheme and use them systematically. Ideally 3 colours maximum makes things easier to process. In general, for audio-visual content, we'll be required to provide a full transcript or captions for any video or audio files. And it's good practice to use a camera to provide a kind of talking head when you or students are presenting in video form, to allow for lip reading and to help with to provide communicative body language. Virtual learning environments, in order to be accessible, generally need a bit of decluttering and organising and labelling of sections. Try to ensure that the student has a consistent journey and learning experience with each module, and that there's clarity in layout and the way in which they need to navigate through each module. And be selective. Don't just chuck up all the online freely accessible content there is. Be very careful about what you're providing, and frame each resource with guidance on its relationship to the module learning outcomes and precisely what you want students to do with it. In general, chunk materials and activities into short units, as we keep hearing. Provide materials in advance of and recordings after any synchronous online learning events. Map out a clear path through your module content and signal key milestones, remembering that students will be progressing through it at different paces. And use available inbuilt accessibility checkers. So Word has its own, PowerPoint has its own, and they're really comprehensive. There are some, I think, discipline-specific issues for us with regards to digital accessibility. For example, we do a lot of detailed work with extracts of text, so it's crucial that we provide extracts in advance and ensure that extracts are in a readable form in terms of font and alignment, or captioned audio versions, for example. We also use a lot of interactive peer discussion, which with the move online will shift to live video chat, but also live writing forms. And students with dyslexia are understandably deterred from contributing to discussion in writing when that writing is going to be seen by their peers. Explicitly set low requirements for punctuation and grammar in text-based form and things like chat bars on Zoom lectures to make it more inclusive. Also enable students to, with specific learning needs, to submit work and contribute to online fora using their preferred format, which might be an audio clip rather than a written paragraph, for example, and vary the formats you use to offer to set tasks, for example. So try to set exercises in a variety of formats. Also, make sure you build in processing time, but I'll pick up on that in a minute. Lastly, we do a lot of kind of peer learning through group work and student created content. So student developed PowerPoints or shared creative writing through sharing written work or recitals or audio-visual kind of performative creative writing. Do encourage students to share their work in multiple formats to make it accessible to other students, and teach students the accessibility basics. These are really important skills for communication and general employability. So moving on to economic accessibility, the pandemic will have potentially reduced the income of many of our students and their families, and some of the consequences of the pandemic risk heightening that disparity between different groups of students in terms of their relative access to learning and retention and progression and performance. With potentially reduced finances comes an increased need for spending more time in more kind of paid employment. Also, some students who may now be studying at home when they're expected to be living away in halls may have to repeatedly defend their choice to spend time studying rather than directly contributing to the household. There may be potentially increased caring responsibilities for some students, particularly if there are new pressures on other members of the family to find paid employment. There's also potential lack of access to computer or to the most recent versions of software, potential limited access to the internet, so limits on data per month or competing for bandwidth, potential lack of access, crucially, to a quiet, uninterrupted study space. And also, with access to library books and peer book sharing reduced or not possible, that creates problems. And without on-campus study space, we're putting quite a lot of students in quite a difficult position potentially. So there's a potentially kind of reduced ability to engage or keep up for quite a bunch of students. There are some general things we can do if our institution or our programme allows to try to mitigate some of this. So as far as possible, facilitate a flexible, self-paced, asynchronous learning journey. Again, chunk materials and tasks into short units. Provide framing context for asynchronous engagement so students aren't kind of lost as to where stuff fits within a module, and make sure you provide feedback on asynchronous engagement too, so that they're getting equitable experiences to students who can keep up on a weekly basis. And make sure you explicitly offer kind of out of phase tutorials so students can talk to you about any bit of the module at any time. With regard to discipline specific issues around economic accessibility, we have a bit of a tendency in our discipline, I think, to be a bit unclear about quite what we expect students to do with some of our material. Well, some of our courses plunge students into self-directed learning with little guidance on quite how much time we want them to spend reading. So be clear about what you want students to do with resources, activities, and especially items on reading lists. Give each task an estimated duration to support students' own time management, but make it clear that you know it will vary between learners. Also, some modules have extensive primary reading lists. That's particularly in literature modules, but linguistic textbooks and theoretical books can also be quite expensive. So consider reducing the amount of primary reading that we're requiring students to do, and particularly cutting expensive texts. Also consider switching to texts that are available as multi-use library e-copies, but of course we have to be mindful of what we've advertised, and also fully available online text tends to be white male Western authors text, so that does potentially counteract some kind of decolonisation and diversifying. But we can also do things like help students sell their second-hand books to the next year group of students. We can do some of the same things with with our often extensive critical or theoretical reading requirements. We can be much more selective. We can also point students towards materials that are available online via other media, so Harvard online lectures, for example, and podcasts. But one key thing to remember is if you're going to provide scanned copies of material that's only available in hard copy, that really does need to be done sort of professionally in order for those PDF extracts to be available, accessible to online screen readers. These are just a couple of resources that I've used to kind of put all this together. That's me done.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrea. that was really full of really important things for us to think about. Thank you, Andrea. How is Rosie? Where's Rosie? I can't see her. I can't see her face. Okay, so what I'm wondering is, so it looks to me like we've lost Rosie. Yeah, Becky's nodding. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do, folks. Thank you, speakers. You kept time absolutely brilliantly. This was going to be our longer session. It was an hour long. The next session is 40 minutes. So what we're going to try and do is tag Rosie onto the beginning of the next session, if that's all right with everybody. Okay, so the next session, so we're going to finish now. The next session is going to begin at 10:35. Okay, and we'll get in contact with Rosie. All right, so the next session will begin with 10:35 with Rosie. We've got a 15-minute break. Please get away from your screens, go out into the sun if it's sunny where you are, okay, and take a break to try and reduce that kind of Zoom exhaustion. And we will see you at 10:35 for Rosie's delayed presentation, with the second section beginning at 10:45, if that's okay with everybody. I mean, it's okay with everybody because that's what we're doing. Okay, folks, see you. I'm going out into the sun. Take my own advice.
Right, Rosie, can you hear me coming through your computer? No, your mic's off. Hang on, let me turn you. You need to unmute yourself. There we go. Okay.
Am I unmuted now?
Perfect.
Okay. Sorry about that, guys.
Don't worry, Rosie. Every day's a school day.
Technology, okay.
Sorry, I disappeared for a little while there. My dog, Bill, just wandered into the room, made eye contact, and then threw up all over the carpet. So
sorry.
I had to do a bit of an emergency cleanup. He's fine. Now he's just snoring away. So, you know, standard dog behaviour.
Pretty good feedback for a Friday.
Yeah. Katie, can I just leave everything in your capable hands?
Yeah, that's fine. We'll
You're
wait
such a
till
star.
35 on the dot and then kick off, yeah?
Perfect.
Well,
Thank you so much. And then yeah, everyone seemed really good about time, so
I'm sure just do a reminder for questions at the end, yeah?
well, no, we're going to do the questions on the Q&A.
Yeah,
questions
we're going to gather them all together at the end, aren't we?
at the final session. That's exactly right. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to mute and step away. I've done my first session, and I'll you'll see my handsome face at 11:30.
Thanks, Katie.
Shall I just pull my PowerPoint up so that's what people would see?
Can do, Rosie. We'll do introductions at the beginning so people know the format of the session, and then we'll kick off with yours first, okay? Okay, everybody, so welcome back. We are now moving on to our second session of the day, which is going to look at reflective online practice in terms of teaching and learning. I'm Katie, I'm going to be chairing this session. So for our lovely speakers who are Rosie, Marcello, Simon, Alice, Catherine, Douglas and Liz, I will be the voice from above that comes in and reminds you when you've got a minute to go if you're going near your time. So because we're absorbing Rosie into this panel, Rosie's paper will be 10 minutes and then all of our other papers will be flash papers, so they will be 5 minutes long. A reminder to everybody who's watching at home, or if you're lucky in your office or wherever you are, please put your questions to our speakers in the Q&A. You'll see that at the bottom right, and we'll be collating those and discussing them in the final panel of the day. So first up, Rosie, take it away.
Thanks very much. Sorry I wasn't with you earlier. Hi. I'm going to be talking a little bit about integrating activities and also assessing them as well. Briefly, a little bit of background about me. And there's a discussion, online discussion in English Studies Guide, which has already been mentioned, and we will put links up to that. In the era of the subject centre, which some of you may know of, others not, I was, amongst other things, a sort of a peripatetic e-learning consultant for the English Subject Centre alongside my role in teaching Victorian Lit. And I visited and demoed some of my online activities to more than 20 English universities and even out of the country as well on occasions. So I used a blended learning model where I was using face-to-face, obviously in the class teaching, but also was using asynchronous discussion forum activities to extend what we started in the classroom. So fully integrated into 2 Victorian literature modules. I was teaching 3rd year undergraduate, they were. I had integrated a suite of activities and they were assessed. This is just a very brief, very contemporary quote from Gilly Salmon, who's already been mentioned, somebody very involved with the theory and practice of online learning. She said there's been 25 years of research and development of online higher education kind of prior to this kind of crisis moment. And there are 2 key threshold concepts to grasp for with digital learning. First, to generate flexibility, pace, motivation, completion of activities, the most successful online experiences are mainly asynchronous. So many of you are probably being encouraged to think about asynchronous activities, not just the online contact hour stuff. So let's assume that you've got some online activities. But assessing them, is that just like 10 steps too far? And here comes, there's my title really, which comes from Alice, Through the Looking Glass. Thank you for giving me an excuse just to show some original Alice explanations. Just too impossible to believe that you could assess this. Well, I mean, maybe you can, and even if you aren't going to, I just want to give you 6 pretty quick kind of suggestions about why it's got potential and is a good thing to think about. So here's the first one. Assessing something for our students communicates it's important to us and to them. It says it's an integral part of the course. Whether we like it or not, and students are motivated, often quite a lot, by assessment. It's telling them what's important. It's going to influence how they use their time, how they construct their knowledge. Also, in a disciplinary sense, it communicates what we think is important in English studies. It's saying we value this, and this is why we are assessing it. I mean, I'm using the word value a lot. It values student time and effort. If you're going to do some online activities, your students are going to put some work into them. How are you going to say to them that that matters and it's not just some kind of add-on, really? If you get the activities right, and I guess this is relates to a point of if you don't want to assess, if you get them right, then they will want to put in the time and effort. And again, that's important to give that some credit, literally. If you aren't going to assess, and maybe quite a lot of you who are listening to this in the short term, that isn't something you're going to do, how do you make your online activities irresistible, that your students will really want to take part in them, which is partly about what you're going to, how they're going to link to what else you're doing, how they're integrated into your course, what are you actually asking them to do that they'll really want to take part in online. If you're using a discussion forum, it's an online learning space. If they're doing the work in that space, it makes no sense to me to take the assessment out of that as though somehow we'll assess it in an essay or an exam. Assess what they're doing in that space. I suppose what that necessitates for us, which is maybe unusual, is that we have to think that actually student work in a discussion forum, the writing that takes place there, is academic work. So we may know what an essay is, we know how to assess that, but what is this stuff, this new kind of writing in a discussion forum? And there is something in the online discussion guide where I talk about that. I do the assessment chapter. Garrison and Anderson suggesting that we listen by reading and talk by writing, I think is quite an interesting way of thinking about what's going on in an asynchronous space. Assessment values diverse learning styles, whether we're on Zoom or MS Teams or whether we're face-to-face. Not everyone contributes equally, however much we try to get them to. discussion forums have been shown, as research on this, to value the quieter ones. Students who want to reflect first. I was very conscious as an undergraduate, I was one of those people, rather than just being the ones who chip in straight away. We learn in different ways, we process in different ways, and the reflector thinkers, the ones who go away reflect, discussion forums can really help them find their voice. Really come into their own sometimes on discussion forums, and it's saying everyone's got something to say, everyone's got something to contribute here, and the quieter ones can post something that will prompt further discussion. It guarantees, to me and the work I did, pretty much 100% participation. So you won't get that kind of experience of, oh, I set something up online and it was all a bit rubbish, and you know, I tried to make it as good as possible, but after a while it all just fizzled out a bit. And if it's assessed and its importance is communicated across the whole course, students will participate. And again, it's a way of saying you've all got something to contribute to this class. You're all a valued part of making this work. We're co-creating this, we're making it work together. And there was something earlier about community, the Royal Holloway notion of community on campus. Community is important to all of us, I think, in our courses at that kind of level as well. And it can foster a real sense of community. So work to do that. I don't have time to talk in detail about assessment criteria, but you can assess anything, arguably, any activity, if you have assessment criteria for it. And I came up with some that are in the online discussion guide. They're not perfect. They've probably changed a bit since 2010 in terms of my continuing to do that work, but they're one version to start with. It also facilitates engagement across the whole course, using a set of activities that are set at intervals throughout the whole course. It means potentially students may engage more across the whole course rather than just a bit of cherry picking. Oh, I'll choose that text to write on in an exam, or I can kind of avoid that week because I don't want to do the essay on that topic text. Ben actually mentioned one of the activities that perhaps became a bit associated with me, of creative critical activities. For example, students role playing. One of my favorites that I did with students was students thank you, role playing as students from role playing as characters from Bleak House, and engaging in a debate in a discussion forum as characters on the topic, "This house believes the law is an ass." You know, goodness, they all read Bleak House. That was amazing. So it can work and get them doing things they'll really want to do. This is almost my final slide. A few questions to you that aren't just about assessment. What can using these online spaces, resources, bearing in mind you're going to have to, what can it add? What can you do in these spaces that are going to enhance what you do, add something new, take your courses into a different way, make them even better? How can you experiment with your students? These are all some things that I've been involved in, linked through to various things, including the online discussion guide. I will obviously pass this on, and good luck.
Thank you, Rosie, that's brilliant. So we're bouncing on swiftly to our 5-minute flash papers now. Marcello, are you ready to kick us off?
I think so. Yeah, can you hear me, Katie? Yeah.
All good.
I'll just share my screen. Oops. Has that come up?
Yeah,
brilliant.
Good.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm Marcello Giovanelli. I'm head of English at Aston University, and I'm going to be talking about using Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, which I know is one of several platforms, and people may have used that to run online seminars and tutorials. So effectively, these are synchronous events where students and a tutor come together and talk through material. And we obviously started using these in March when lockdown began, but I've been trialing these for some point before that. And the university's plan from September is to have a 1+1 model, so 1 hour of asynchronous learning material, and then follow it up with this synchronous event. So I'm just going to outline 6 things that I've learned along the way. Some of them are fairly basic, but I hope they will be useful to those who perhaps are coming at this for the first time. So the first thing to, if I can get the screen to work. First thing to highlight is it's really, really important, I think, to make sure that you have a link to this area, this seminar tutorial area visible. I struggled a lot at the beginning where students were going into Blackboard via different places and ending up in this sort of, you know, this twilight zone somewhere in the depths of Blackboard, and they weren't in the seminar group that I wanted them to be in. So make sure it's really visible. We have a layout in our department where we have week by week details for each area of the module, and I make sure that I foreground that space right at the top so that students can see how they need to access that material and how that seminar. Number 2, assume nothing. Everybody is learning. Students won't come to us, I think, with lots of experience of this. They'll be as much novices as we are, well, my students are anyway, and they'll be anxious and lack confidence as well. So it's really important to think about that, to contextualize that, to establish ground rules and patterns of working, but also to set very clear expectations as well, as you might do in a normal seminar context. So around, for example, turning off a mic, the use of video, when it's appropriate to write things in chat and the kind of language it's appropriate to use, background noise, and so forth. Andrea talked about learning needs earlier in her talk. I think also we need to be careful around the sort of accessibility agenda and making sure that students have access regardless of who they are. And again, this has come up in other talks. We are discussing at the moment the ethics of actually recording these, and you know, it's worth just making sure you're very clear on that, and making sure that students are very clear on whether they're being recorded or not, and where that material is going to end up. As an institution, we're still in discussions around that. One of the things that I have up, for example, then would be something like this in one of the first sessions, just to make sure that students are aware of the sort of protocols around confirming they can hear me, and expectations around mics and videos, and the use of hands up rather than sort of coming in. And I think that's it's really important to set those up at the beginning. Another thing I learned very quickly is to get to move away from those very awkward moments that we all have when we log on to Teams or Collaborate or whatever it is, and we're waiting for the session to start, and we're sort of anxiously sitting in the background. So be prepared for early arrivals. Have something on screen, a simple starter activity, a piece of text with some questions. It really doesn't matter what it is. Clearly it needs to be linked to some previous learning and anticipate what's to come. But that's so important, I think, and it sets a really good scene and context for the seminar to continue for that. And it's very easy to have a bank of these and link these to other learning activities on the module as well. Blackboard Collaborate Ultra has breakout groups. Now, these are designed to replicate sort of face-to-face groups, so you can split students up in groups and get them to talk. This is a great tool, but it needs to be handled with care, and there are some limitations. Blackboard can randomly assign students if you want it to, but my experience is it's much better to think carefully about which students are going to go in each group, much as you might do for in a normal campus situation. Don't expect students to know what to do at the beginning. My experience has been that you have to take a very stepped approach with very short sessions, and really the content is secondary to the protocols around behaviour and group dynamics and the rest of it. So really walk through this with students and make sure that they're very clear as to what they can do and the expectations you have. On Blackboard, you can visit groups and listen in, but actually you can't sort of monitor all the groups at the same time. So it can be quite difficult to see how some groups are operating unless you specifically put yourself in there. So have strategies to think about that and manage that. And don't let attendees switch groups either. That's really important. Vevox is great. If you haven't come across Vevox, get it. You can subscribe to it. It's really, really useful. You can set polls, quizzes, and the rest of it. All the things that you can't do in Blackboard, which is very limited in terms of polls and multiple choice. So I found that really useful. And I just want to end, and Gilly Salmon's been mentioned many times today, and there's a reason for that. Her books are brilliant on online learning. So she's got some really good stuff in her eTivities book about these sort of dimensions of distance, and students being distant in terms of being alone in place, but also psychological distance. And I found her work, and I won't go into it in any detail here, obviously, but I found her work really useful in terms of thinking about how we can plan for emotional needs and not just learning objectives when it comes to setting up online seminars. Blackboard Collaborate Ultra does have a tool that allows students to say whether they're happy, sad, confused, surprised, and so forth. There are various icons they can click on. But I found Salmon's work really useful in terms of thinking about how you can manage some of the emotional aspects of learning. And she's got a really good section on what she calls patterns of participation, which are the kinds of learners that you tend to, or the kinds of characteristics of different learners you tend to see in online platforms. The book is here, if you haven't seen it. It's about online learning broadly, but I would say that if you're looking at setting up seminars and tutorials, it's very, very useful for that. And it's been a really helpful resource for me over the last few months. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm aware we're actually bouncing through at 5 minutes, so well done on that one. Right to the wire. And next we have Simon, please.
Hello.
Hi, Simon.
Hello. So, well, first of all, I just want to explain where I am. I'm speaking at a desk underneath a bunk bed, like in Big, as my dean reminded me a few days ago, such as lockdown and online communication. I wanted to speak about 3 things, if possible, if I get time. Software, hardware, and collaboration. Which the first 2 sound technical, but the thing that it keeps being reiterated by experience is that these problems are technological and they are pedagogical, but they're also social and cultural. And the way that they are, the social and cultural elements are interacting with the technical in particular problems is I find really interesting. So I've been involved in English at Exeter discussions, particularly in working parties on the issue of online learning through the summer. But I was also made director of online learning for the college in June. So I've had an interesting kind of 2-level kind of view of it. There's been a lot of talk about asynchronous, obviously, and synchronous teaching, and the necessity of asynchronous teaching in online learning. I absolutely accept, but I wanted to kind of concentrate a little bit in my talk on the synchronous aspect, and in particular, the seminar and the how we replicate is the wrong word, and I know that we all kind of accept that to a certain extent, but how do we provide something that is equivalent? Because in a sense, well, certainly I think of the English literature seminar as the kind of the staple learning environment. We were thrown into it in the last few weeks of March, and we all had to learn very quickly at Exeter how to teach online for that last couple of weeks of our term anyway. Very quickly, a Microsoft Teams license was issued to students, and they had to learn to use it as well. Many of them hadn't used it before. We were all learning on the job. There was a novelty element, which was interesting. But also, one of the things that we learned very quickly was that idea of the 2-hour online seminar doesn't really work. And the way that we approached that really was that we ended up very quickly splitting groups of 16 into 2 groups of 8. And there were variations in different seminar groups in their responses, but I found that one of the things that really pleased me was that some quieter students engaged a lot more. And that was largely through the chat and text functions. And that was really encouraging, and that gave me food for thought and ideas.
1 minute, Simon.
Thank you. So I'm going to move across to the hardware now. One of the interesting things that we're looking at, I don't know if anybody's come across this, is the idea of the meeting owl, which is a technical equipment that sits in the middle of the room and switches the online user by hearing speech. So the video moves around. Because this started with discussions in archaeology and drama, but we're looking at this maybe across the whole of the college now. And I think that this, in terms of hardware, this is the most interesting element that could be that could change the way that we teach seminars, particularly in terms of blended learning. I'll probably end there. Actually, I'm probably not going to be able to speak about collaboration. But thanks very much.
We're running out of time. Thank you so much for that, though, Simon. We're moving on to Alice now.
Hi, I've just unmuted myself. Can you hear me? Great. I'm going to share my screen, but I only really have one slide. It's mainly just so that you don't have to look at my face quite so much. Right, so I'm going to talk a bit about some of my experiences of teaching a course which is taught face-to-face at our main campus and also taught through blended learning through some partner colleges. So I've taught that course for 10 years now nearly, and also overseen and coordinated that provision. So we've taught it in English literature, but we also for a time ran English language through blended learning as well. So I want to take a bit of a subject specific focus, but mostly reflect on how we introduce students to learning in the first year of undergraduate study and what that's going to mean for students who are now moving into blended learning in their second or third year because of the pandemic. So these are students that we've inducted into ways of teaching in face-to-face in the first year who are now going to have to do something potentially a bit different. So one of the things that we like to do in the first year, I think probably all of us, is to ask students to reflect on what it means to be a student in our discipline. So how they're going to be a student in English lit or language or creative writing. So for me, that often involves asking students what their models are, so where they've got their ideas about what it means to study at university. For lots of my students every year, it's usually that they've watched Gilmore Girls on Netflix and they think that their life's going to be a lot like Rory Gilmore. And so one of the things that I have tried to do with the online element of blended learning is to ask students to think about the kinds of models or scripts, as Ben Knights calls them, for thinking about how their learning might unfold in an online space. So what experience they have already about talking about books online. So I'm not suggesting a technology to you or a technique, I'm suggesting a conversation here that you might have with your students. So what experiences do you have in talking about books online or in talking about text or language? So the conversations that unfolded with my students were that they talked to me about their experience of using platforms like Wattpad to talk about fan fiction. Some of them were really active on Goodreads and were writing book reviews that they shared in a social way. Some of them were really active on Bookstagram and were really interested in cultivating this kind of a bookish self-image for themselves through their social media. So we thought a lot about the idea of posting and about how different kinds of platforms enable a different way of talking about the subject that we were going to build on in our studies. So this became really interesting for me, and I've ultimately ended up building it into part of the later course that we do on the history of the book, and we talk a lot about book publishing and books on the internet. So those conversations with students that came about because of blended learning have fed back into some of my pedagogy and some of the content that I teach. Okay, the second and final point that I want to make is about the status of asynchronous writing activities in online learning. So I think probably quite a lot of the instruction that will have come from institutions is about how to use technology for synchronous teaching. And I want to kind of mount a bit of a defense of the message board or the discussion forum here, because of the way that it allows us to develop a kind of writing in our students which is very low stakes and which completely breaks the relationship between writing and assessment. So for lots of my students, their impression is that writing is something which has to be assessed or graded, or which we're judging them on, and that the discussion board or the message board becomes a place for writing in the discipline, where writing can be exploratory and unpolished, and sometimes dumb or weird or wrong. And so what I've put up here on the slide, I didn't want to share any of my students' dumb or weird or wrong writing, deliberately so, but I've posted some of the images that they've put on the message boards recently, or that they've sent to me. So they've become fluent in the kinds of online bookish talk, which involve memes and which involve jokes, Twitter jokes, riffing on memes and jokes, and being able to use specifically online discourse to talk about books. Okay, that's all I have.
Great, thank you so much, Alice. Brilliant. Right, we are bouncing ever onwards, and next up we have Catherine.
Great. Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Catherine. Yeah.
Excellent. All right, let me now next try and share my screen. Screen.
Yep, got you.
That worked. Amazing. Yep. Okay. Hello, today I'm going to introduce Aropa peer review software, briefly outline how I've used it in my teaching, and explain where you can go to find out more. Simply put, Aropa is a software program that allows students to peer review one another's work in progress, and so it provides the possibility of further asynchronous student engagement. It's designed by Helen Purchase and John Hamer and used by a wide range of national and international HE institutions. It's completely free, and speaking from experience, it's really easy to use. I've just put here a caveat about how the statistics may be used by John and Helen, but there's more info on this on the website, which I'm going to link to at the end of this talk. When you get started on Aropa, you are given an online class and you add your student users to this. You can make various decisions about how many reviews students undertake, whether reviews are randomly assigned or distributed by you, and whether you can read reviews. There may be moments where you need to intervene or give your input in a review. So for instance, I read each review and I emailed the student whose work was the subject of that review with some additional input. Next, you need to specify to the students the format and the deadline of their initial submission and the deadline for them to return their peer review. When I used this on my postgraduate taught course, I went very simple. I just asked students to submit a 500-word chunk from anywhere in the longer essay they were writing. But Aropa is used by all sorts of subject areas, so it's really up to you what you ask for. Where you will need to give more guidance, though, is with the peer review process itself. Aropa allows you to design a rubric for this peer review, which can be as general or as detailed as you like. For my course, I asked students to write a couple of sentences in response to a series of questions about the chunk of essay they were reviewing. They were asked to summarize its argument, to comment on any strengths or areas for improvement, and comment on the referencing, spelling, and grammar. Finally, they were asked to suggest any further reading they had come across that might help their fellow student. And these prompts are all located within Aropa, so students have a really clear structure to follow for their review. Here we can see the timeline. When you are setting up the task, you have various options. For instance, you can ensure that students can't see the reviews their work has received until they've submitted a certain number of reviews themselves. At the end of the process, they can also compare their review of a piece to other students' reviews of the same piece, giving them a kind of bird's eye view of the reviewing process. My experience of using Aropa was very positive. All the students who took part said it had helped them to see how to more effectively structure and present their own work. I promoted Aropa on an opt-in basis for my course this year. In the future, I would like to use it with a whole class, But as well as making it more difficult potentially for the instructor to read all reviews, that does raise the possibility of students not engaging and specifically not completing reviews for various reasons.
1 minute.
But you can go in and reassign reviews within Aropa once the process has already started, if that's necessary. Meeting the deadlines for submission and review was also a bit of a problem. You can easily go into Aropa if needed and grant extensions, but obviously you would want to factor that in by starting the process far enough in advance of the actual assignment deadline for your course. Some students had a few technical difficulties, but Aropa has a very useful feature that allows you as the instructor to impersonate a specific student. So you can go in and see what they are seeing and hopefully point them in the right direction if they're struggling to find something. If you'd like to learn more about Aropa, the web page here gives a much more comprehensive walkthrough, and you can read publications describing its use in different subject areas. If you decide to use Aropa, you can get started by contacting Helen and John for a login and any further advice. And if you could also let me know if this presentation has convinced you to give it a go, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Perfect timing. Well done. To the second, amazing. So next up, no pressure, we've got Douglas.
I was just thinking, I feel a lot of pressure now. I'll do my best. Okay, I just want to start by saying that I am coming to this from really no experience of teaching online, so it's all, what you're about to hear from me is kind of work in progress, which I hope in and of itself will be useful. And you know, there's probably things you're going to hear that are stupid and you can correct, and things that hopefully will give you some things to think about. But I want to just outline a couple of principles about how I'm intending to use online discussion, which we've already heard a little bit about in general, for my fiction writing classes in particular, and then a kind of practical example, a sort of framework of how I'm thinking of using the discussion forum in practice. I have to say that the document that Benjamin and Rosie, who we've heard from, have alluded to, that they were part of putting together about online learning, is a really great resource that I've used to help kind of shape my thinking as I get into this further. Having used up 1 minute on that, I'll now move into my principles. Are kind of things we've heard before mostly, and I won't repeat all of them, but I just want to say that one of my things I want to achieve with my online discussion forums is giving students a foundation for the discussions that we have in a kind of synchronous live online setting or in classroom setting, and also try and link discussions from one week's reading to the next week's reading together, so that there's kind of always a bridge between weeks as well as a foundation for each individual week. I want to keep this simple, and I want students to lead it. So those are my principles. In practice, what I've come up with as a way of trying to make this happen is to, for every workshop group I have or seminar group I have, there's assigned reading in addition to the student workshop stuff, is assign a host to each week's assigned reading. Sometimes 2 hosts, depending on how big the group is, so that everyone will host 1 session every term, only 1 session that they have to host. The host has an obligation to post in the discussion forum 150 to 200 word statement about that reading, anything that interested them. There'll be a bit, I'm not going to go into like how I would guide and scaffold each moment of this, but just a general kind of thing. I'm already halfway through my thing. Each host would post 150 to 200 words before class, on noon the day before class, so there's time for everyone to read it. That would also include a discussion question. I think that's short enough to be accomplishable. It's long enough to be substantive and useful to everyone in the discussion. This will form part of the basis for any synchronous discussion, but will also form a starting point for the asynchronous discussion. Everyone else in the class has, from that moment at noon before the class is going to meet until 2 days after the class has met, to respond in 75 to 150 words. Again, short enough but long enough to that question, or any questions that develop out of it. Again, specific guidance I could develop more, but I'm not going to talk about now. So they can post before, during, after the seminar on that discussion, so that there's a kind of free flow between what we're talking about, what we're writing about. And then after so they have up to 2 days after the seminar to do that. The third day, the host will then respond in a kind of summary way, again, 150 to 200 words, reflecting on that whole few days worth of discussion from their starting point back through the seminar, through the online discussions, and they'll kind of provide a summary for that. My idea is that first host is sort of finishing off 1 week's discussion, while the next discussion is about to be or has already been started by the host or hosts of the coming week, so that there's a kind of baton handover from 1 week to the next, and that we can use this stuff again and again. There's a repository that we can go back to. Students can pilfer what they've written on there for essays that they have to write later. I have no problem with that. But we've created a kind of whole little ecosystem of discussion that hopefully can go back and forth between the live activities, the workshop activities that are slightly separate but related, I see you, and and the discussion of published material that we're talking about. And that is 4.5 minutes. I think I'll just leave it there.
Okay, that's fine. I'm aware my big brother head looms in
Yeah,
with about a minute to go. One out, it's fine. That's fine. But yeah, 4 minutes 30 is probably a record, so you can take that and run. And last but not least, we have Liz. Liz, are you ready?
Liz is having some trouble with her internet connection. I've just been speaking with her, so if it's possible, can we put her in the next session rather than this one?
We can indeed, yes. So I'm presuming that given that, we will probably bring this in 5 minutes early and let people just move our break around, if that's okay again. So we will bring this in now and we will start the next session 5 minutes early as a result, if that's all right with everybody. You get an unexpectedly quick tea break thanks to our rapid panelists. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. That was brilliant. And we will see you back here at 5 minutes before the advertised time on the schedule. Thanks, everyone.
Great work, Katie. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everybody. That was a really good session.
Okay, so we're starting 11:25.
Becky, can you hear me?
Yes.
Claudia, could I just practice closing the sharing of the screen? Because we don't normally use Zoom in my university. So I've tried it with Hannah yesterday and I can't get, but I don't know how to close it. So would you mind?
Of course, no, go for it.
Thanks. So you see, I'm not really sure. So it's if it says share, you see, I don't know. Okay. I need to allow first. Okay. So I'm gonna check again. No, it's not doing anything. Okay. Why is it not?
Hi there. I'm just curious if I can also do a practice quickly before we start.
Sure.
I'm just going to try it really quickly.
Silly me. Okay, it's different. Okay.
Just my slideshow now.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, Yasmin, that's working.
Okay, great. That's all I wanted to know. And you only see my PowerPoint.
That is right. Yes.
Thank you.
How do you get out of? Oh, okay.
Then there's a red and green button on top, and it says Stop Share.
Okay.
On the very top.
Let's give it. Can I give it a go then? Okay. So I close this. I didn't seem to be able to use to see my desktop. Is that normal?
I can't see your screen yet, Claudia.
Oh, okay.
Claudia, just to say, this is the very first time you ever do this. My software asked me to allow and then close the software and then start it again in order for the permissions to be there.
Okay. So he's asking now for a password, yes.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it's the same as the meeting then.
But you are sharing your screen right now.
Am I? Okay.
Okay, I'm off now, sorry.
I'm so sorry. What have I done now?
There we go.
I don't know what he wants. I don't know. Well, I'm not sure what's happening.
We can see your desktop and now your PowerPoint.
Okay, but I've lost you though. I can't see anything anymore. I'm not sure what I've done. Lovely. Sorry.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry. Becky, I think that Shelley also needs a participant link.
Yes, I have just
Okay, fine.
transformed Shelley into a panelist, so she should now be able to get on.
Sorry to interrupt, Claudia. Thank you, Becky.
No, it's just, it keeps asking for a password. I'm going to put the password and then hopefully that's it.
Does your PowerPoint have sound?
No, it's just images.
Okay, then you don't need to do that because it's asking to share audio from your computer.
Ah, okay.
So we can now see your PowerPoints. If you just click Start PowerPoint, then we'll be able to see it.
So can I ask, why can't I see like us as a meeting? Do you see what I mean?
Can you see any faces down the side of your screen in a bar?
No.
No.
And do you see my, yeah, can you see now? Oh, I can see a black, oh, it's gone. Oh, there. Okay, I put something at the bottom now. So if I see participants, I can see is that right? Oh, okay, it looks a bit different now. Okay. So now I just can do the PowerPoint, is that right?
Yeah, that's working.
Yeah.
Becky, I'm sorry to interrupt again. Rebecca Gregory too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me mute myself.
want to quick say hello to Becca Gregory, who's just joined us. Are you in all right, Becca? Is everything okay?
It looks fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
No, thank you.
All right, no problem.
I'll shut up now.
Me too.
There's still a few minutes before we begin, so I'm just saying that really.
I just had a quick chat with Liz Ford, and unfortunately her internet's gone down, so she's
Okay.
not able to join us, but she's going to record herself doing her presentation and share it with us so we can pop it on the repository, so at least we'll get to see it, just not live.
Oh, that's
Okay,
great.
so if I understand, so she's cancelled from the program and going to be in the repository.
Yes.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
a real that's a loss, but it's okay. We'll be.
Well, she's still part of the conversation, so that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Okay, and we'll still start at 11:25 in that case, because that's what we told people.
And amazingly flexible of her.
I know, she was brilliant. Yeah.
That's what we're going to be next year. Super flexible.
Okay.
I hope so.
So I better tell everybody. Shelley, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. It's fine. You're going to ask me to be first up, aren't you?
You read my mind. Thank you.
That's absolutely fine.
Okay, fantastic. The only thing I want to say is that our distinction between the questions and answers and chat doesn't seem to have worked in quite such a watertight way as we had wanted.
No, it's not.
Poor Gail. Okay, right. So can I ask Gail and Katie, can we sweep through both the Q&As and the chat, and in the Q&As even the answers, just to try and generate some of those questions to harvest to supply for Gail for the last session?
So I've got about 8 general questions which we can kick off with, so that's okay. Fine. I've been looking at both of them. So
okay, so
if you can begin to pick them up from the start of the final session, that would be fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're doing okay. Yeah.
Keeping to time, which is fabulous, and I'm feeling more reassured than I was 2 hours ago, which is very good.
Yeah, yeah. They've all been really great. You've all been really great. Sorry, we're talking as if it's private, when in fact we're speaking quite to everybody. That's right.
And also how lovely it is, like at this point of the academic year, to see like over 130 people in a room. It's really lovely.
Yeah, and actually, and also, while I was doing this kind of in the coffee queue chat, also from people right the way across the career spectrum, looking at the participants from very senior members of the discipline to all the way through to ECAs and graduate students. That's just really, really fantastic. I think it's a sign that how committed we are to our teaching and making our teaching excellent in our kind of post-COVID-y world. That's a really, really encouraging thing. Okay, and on that, I'm rushing back with my coffee in imaginary kind of way, and we're going to restart. Hi everybody, we're restarting for our 3rd session. I'm afraid that we have lost Liz Ford altogether. Her internet has gone down. That reminds us some of the things that Andrea was talking about in the very first session, I suppose. But she's going to record and put her presentation, which will end up in the repository, so we'll be able to see it anyway. Again, let me encourage you to put anything you find in the next few weeks, send it to Rebecca Fisher at the English Association. She'll put it in the repository. The more things we have, the better. So I'm going to begin this third session with Shelley Harris, who is a lecturer in creative writing at the University of Reading. Shelley, take it away.
Hello, everyone. So as part of my role as a creative writing lecturer, I connect students with the world of publishing, and earlier this year I organised an employability event designed to bring my students into contact with guests from the publishing industry. They were early career publishing professionals with vital intel about landing a first job in the sector. We were good to go. We literally ordered the cake, and then lockdown came. So I redesigned it as an online event using my institution's remote learning platform, which is Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. But crucially, my aim remained the same, which was to facilitate meaningful interpersonal connection. So my question for this flash paper is, can you do that online? We had 31 students and 4 guests. The first half of the event was a panel discussion with students mic and video off, putting questions in chat, which were then moderated just like today. And for the second half, students were put into small groups, each with one of those publishing professionals. And I invited them to turn on cameras and mics if they were comfortable with that. So what did I learn? And can online learning really make meaningful connections between people? So we already know that online learning robs us of eye contact and body language and nuance and so on, which I'm frankly keenly missing at the moment. However, the functionality of many of our online learning platforms offer real advantages, and my argument is that we should leverage these advantages. So I just want to share with you a bit of student feedback. So the top comment here from a student, the question is, what do you think made it easier that we were online? This responder says, asking questions in a small group who cannot see you, they obviously didn't turn on their camera for the small group. A large classroom that can see you can be quite daunting because you hesitate to ask a question since you're afraid that other people might mock you for the question that you're asking. The less face-to-face interaction is, the more liberty participants have to express themselves freely. And whilst on the surface this might seem counterintuitive, in fact we know it's true. We know it's true from social media. We know it's true from research about the learning preferences of our neurodiverse students. And actually Simon referred to it earlier. He said he was really pleased his quieter students contributed more in online seminars. So the title of this presentation, I Can't Look You in the Voice, comes from this telegram sent by Dorothy Parker to her editor when she was suffering from writer's block. And as you can see, it is very, very emotionally transparent. And it's emotionally transparent because she protected herself with layers of depersonalization. It wasn't an in-person conversation. It wasn't even a phone call. It was a telegram. And what I learned is that online learning offers layers, a hierarchy actually of depersonalization, from the most face-to-face, which is cameras and mics on, to mics only, to text chat, which identifies the students, to, if your platform allows it, whiteboard. So whiteboard is completely anonymous. Students just click in and they say what they want to, and it offers them the most liberty to express themselves.
1 minute.
So, and that's, sorry? 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay, super quick then. We found in the event that in the small groups, if lower stakes, more anonymized, more depersonalized conversations started things, then those higher stakes face-to-face conversations went more smoothly. That's something that's really hard to do on campus. It's also really hard on campus to talk privately with the student in pajamas, which was something that we just, when we turned on the cameras, what I can do is private message her, which I can't in real life, very, very quickly, because I know I'm coming to the end of my time. Did we make meaningful human interactions? We did, not perfectly, but we did. Student feedback was very positive. And one example was a few hours after the event, I received an email from one of the speakers. She said, I want to share the artwork with one of your students, that one of your students has done, with editors and designers at my children's publisher to see if I can further her career. So that gave me great hope and encouragement that we can indeed bring people together in meaningful ways as we continue to teach online. That's me done.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Our next speaker is Dr. Sophie Nichols, University Teaching Fellow, Teesside University. Where have you gone? Sophie, take it away.
Hi everybody, can you hear me okay whilst I just
Yep.
share my screen? Here we go. Right, I just have to move you out of the way on my screen, Bob. There we go. I bet nobody's ever said that to you before. So I wanted to talk to you today about this idea of creating learning communities online. I've also just tried to put in the chat a link to my blog, where there's a longer version of this talk with lots of links out to resources, videos that I've made, because I've been working with staff at Teesside around the move to online. And I think it's in the resources page as well, the link to that. So just to say, if you want to follow along whilst I'm talking and just explore some of those links, please do. But really, I want to talk about this idea of community. We've heard some fantastic things already this morning, I think, about this. And what I really want to say is three main points. The first one being, this is not about the technology. This is actually about the things that you already know how to do. So I've been running an MA in creative writing online at Teesside for 6 years. I've designed lots of online learning experiences over the last 20 years. And I think the key thing that I've learned is that it's not about the technology. And you know, everybody here attending this session this morning has fantastic skills in creating communities in different ways, in sharing our writing and our reading together and our thinking and our reflecting. And this is really just about continuing to do that. It's about the pedagogy, it's about all of the wonderful practice that you already do, and reimagining that and re-exploring it in a different kind of space. So it's not about the technology. Yes, you might have to think about how you might set up a Google Doc to create an online workshop space, or you might need to think about how you use discussion forums, but it's actually really about the good practice that you already do. Andrea gave us a fantastic overview of all the different kinds of accessibility and equity that you need to think about. And for me, this is really key when you think about building a strong learning community. And for me, one of the things that I'm actually quite passionate about is this idea that so many people have touched on already this morning, which is about asynchronous versus synchronous. So for me, this is absolutely crucial. I teach students across lots of different time zones, so asynchronous is really important. But throughout this period of COVID-19, it has become even more important for some of the things that people have already mentioned. You know, people have so many different pressures on their time at the moment. Finding space to reflect and to study and to find some quiet time is very hard. And I think as we move into September, this is going to be difficult. So I think this is a big sort of political challenge for us actually in the sector, because you know what we've heard already this morning is that some of our institutions are insisting that we do some synchronous. So how can we work with that and make sure that we are creating opportunities that don't make a lot of our students feel excluded? So on my blog and on the resources, there are some tools for asynchronous learning and some ideas about that. The other concept that I want to mention that for me is absolutely crucial is this idea of presence. So lots of people have mentioned the wonderful Gilly Salmon, who's done lots of work around the idea of presence. There's no real kind of consensus about what we mean by presence in online teaching. Is it about emotion? Is it about warmth? Is it about interconnectivity? For me, it's about how we be there with our students and for our students. And online, we have to sort of we have to work harder, I think, to make our presence visible. So how do we do that? And this could be through video, it could be through spontaneous sorts of videos, it could be through very low-tech things like how you might use email. Thinking about the access issues that we've talked about for our students. So this doesn't have to be complicated, but it's really about how you drop into the rhythm of online learning, which could be very different from the thing that we're used to, which is maybe delivering something in a compressed way, in a 2 or 3 hour seminar group, for example, and how we can give our students that really reassuring presence that they need. Because actually, I think in the times that we're living through, this is probably the most important thing that we can give them, more than any sort of content. So I just want to leave you with this wonderful quote, really, from the lovely Philip Gross, who talks about a workshop as a small world, and it's a kind of hybrid model, and I think that's just really perfect for the sort of things that we're thinking about today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Really appreciate that. And again, bouncing through in Katie's words, our next speaker is Yasmin Sharma, lecturer in English literature from the University of Reading. Yasmin, I can't see you somewhere.
Okay,
there you are.
I'm working on it.
Yeah, see you.
So, can you see my slide now?
Yeah,
okay,
we can. Great. Thank you so much.
All right, so this is about the class blog, and I think that when I say blog, we think of learning journals and Blackboard, and that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. I started doing a blog maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago when I was teaching in America, and the maximum benefit of this mode was not something that I foresaw. It was a sort of accidental discovery, which students have definitely told me they've appreciated. So I'll get there in a minute, but first I will just say that two of the major benefits of this mode of teaching, or actually this sort of like peripheral aspect to my teaching, has been that it allows class to keep going, or seminar to keep going beyond the limits of class time and space as normally prescribed in normal life, in which we would meet once a week or twice a week. And then the other is to give students a sense that they have a voice and that they are that theirs is a meaningful contribution to make to like an ongoing active discourse, as opposed to sort of field of secondary criticism available to them only on JSTOR. So I heard Andrew say students are missing each other, and this is a way in which that feels like there's a remedy within it. And another, Douglas mentioned, I want to keep this simple and I want students to lead it, and indeed I share those concerns. The platform that I've been using for my blogs is Weebly. And I would just say I started off trying out WordPress, Blogger, Squarespace. I landed on Weebly, and specifically not Blackboard. What I'm going to be showing you throughout this as an example is just my most recent blog for our Me Too module. I recognize that Me Too is a really contemporary and exciting, engaging sort of material, but I would say that I've also used this kind of platform to teach 18th century American literature. So I'm just trying to think of like the most far away from the Me Too movement topic. But yeah, and it's worked well for all kinds of topics. I don't use Blackboard for many reasons. I won't go into those. I'll just say why I'm using Weebly. It's allows a commenting function that lets students talk to each other mostly. And it also allows me to be a moderator in a way that doesn't get in their faces. It's sort of behind the scenes moderation. And it makes them feel like they're just engaging with something that honestly, it's quite easy to make look pretty. And so moving forward, I'll just say that Weebly has a education platform. It's called like Weebly for Education. It costs me $3 a month. I use that because it allows for me to password protect everything and allows students in and have a sense of a safe space. So some tips and tricks for the little class blogs that I make. One is to be extremely engaging in the first week and dare to use really cheap attention grabbers in order to get the conversation going. Another is that in the sidebar, I like to list questions and prompts that help students get an idea of what we might want to talk about in seminar when seminar was in real life. Thirdly, utilizing multimedia. Even if you're not dealing with really fresh contemporary material, you can still, for example, I teach American poetry. The archive Pen Sound has all kinds of sound bites. You can link them in. It makes the amount of material they have to get through less daunting, and presents it to them in a highly clickable fashion, which is something that they're doing anyways in their lives. And then the very first week, I require them to comment on the blog just to get their feet wet right from the start. And I make it a very short word length. So I say the first week is a required commentary, 250 to 500 words, whatever you want. Just to make them start to feel, it's just like when you're trying to encourage class participation in a real life class, to just get them talking with each other. just some more examples of the sorts of things that you're able to do through this. You can really start conversations through that discussion sidebar that I make sure to keep going. I also really enjoyed that, for example, there on the left image, you see where it says week 2 against misogyny. Those were the readings they were expected to do in advance of our seminar meeting. But then at the top, I could post a more recent blog post, which included links to all the things that came up during class discussion. So I felt it was like a really kind of fluid mode of keeping notes, not just for the students, but also for myself on what we had all talked about, and making everything accessible without fear of copyright. Everything is just very, again, clickable.
1 minute.
Okay, I'm just gonna whiz through then. So it's password protected. As you see at the very bottom there, I think it's really important as a lecturer to chime in to the discussions as they start, so that students really feel that their voice is being heard, and then also to make sure to comment on their comments in the next seminar, not just online. The best thing about this is that students start to talk to each other. So this is just me trying to show you that students start commenting on each other's comments, and the tone has always successfully been kind and comfortable. You can make notes to students on this blog. It's a way of giving announcements. They have one place that they have to go to, as opposed to multiple places for reading lists, etc. Integrating in-class discussions, and then integrating class discussions outwards. Lots of sources being sourced, not just through myself on the left, but through students on the right. I was really impressed to see the way that students shared all kinds of sources. This is my cheeky taking the ass out of assessment. I asked students to submit their 3 favorite comments, their 3 most interesting comments as an assessment. That was also successful. And then the very last thing is just to say that students were encouraged to then create their own as a final project. So this is a student's blog, which she gave me permission to share with you all. She did the painting, she created the blog, and she wrote all the material. So that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciated that. Our next speaker, JT Welsh, lecturer in English and Creative Industries at the University of York. Fantastic.
I'm just sharing my screen. And is that all good? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So this has come up a few times already in a few talks today, but I just want to use my slot to kind of further the case for using guest speakers, visiting speakers, in relation to online teaching. So I'll start with 3 very obvious reasons for this. Online teaching, number 1, means that we're all in the content business now, in desperate need of engaging, sustainable resources. Bringing in exciting speakers with different perspectives is also just good pedagogy, I think, and it can help with workloads. Number 2, online platforms are made for this kind of collaboration, as a few people have mentioned, and it's a chance to bring in guests you could never afford to fly in from across the world for just a mini lecture or a Q&A, and as a bonus, there's no passport checks, so that's always good. And number 3, I think it's an important way of maintaining links with a wider community and supporting and feeding back into wider disciplinary networks and non-academic experts at a time when they really need it. So briefly, I'll just talk a bit about my recent experience. I convened an undergraduate module called The Business of Books at York, which ran entirely online over the past few months in our summer term. And as the name of the module suggests, this is one that gives students an overview of contemporary publishing industry. And like a lot of modules, that outward focus, it presented particular challenges for teaching in isolation. So this particular module was also developed with money from HIFE, or the Higher Education Innovation Fund, to work with an external partner. And it was co-designed with New Writing North, which is a regional arts organization. And they also previously co-delivered the lectures and helped coordinate a series of visiting writers and publishers on the module. So in other words, it's a module that cannot possibly run without external input. So in practice, this meant three things for us. In the first instance, we had to work with these guests individually to find the best practice for individual weeks, individual visits. And as other people have been saying, there's no single best platform for this. It also became clear that there's no single best format for this, for virtual visits as well. Some of them works better as mini lectures or interviews in some cases. Some were different lengths, some were video, some were audio with or without slides. Most of the writers and the publishers, it's worth saying, on this module were separate from the conversations that we're having about online pedagogy within our disciplines. And so it was really helpful getting perspectives on the different things they were doing in their own industries and how technologies they were using. For related reasons, we also had to reorganize and rethink our VLE content. We needed to go beyond this idea of replacing lectures, as others have said, towards something I think that's more like the range of media content that students will encounter in other contexts, wherever that might be, on social media. So shorter recordings and little things like labeling the type of media. This is just a capture of our VLE site. You can see these headings, things to do, things to read. But putting the times and saying what kind of content it was, it seemed to really help the students with their engagement and to fit things within their own circumstances and their needs. And thirdly, the observation we had was that we had to really think differently, or we had an opportunity to think differently about who might contribute. So my colleague on the module, Alexander Kingston Reese, and I, we both have partners in our household who also teach English at other institutions, who we roped in for more specific interviews about academic publishing or creative writing. And I'm not suggesting that anyone plans their love life around online teaching needs, but with the changes to lockdown restrictions and social bubbles and things, I think there will be opportunities to think about collaborating locally as well as globally. So just kind of wrapping this all up, then if nothing else, I hope these fairly obvious suggestions have the effect of a general encouragement to consider working with guests as we plan for different modes of teaching next year. Without wishing to boast too much or too vaguely, engagement on our module was beyond anything I could have imagined. During the most intense weeks of lockdown, guest contributions helped with workloads, made for richer, more varied content, which we can now reuse. And they were a meaningful opportunity to work with authors, freelancers, others in the creative industries at a time when they need it. So I'm thinking of all the brilliant live stream events we've all been watching the past few months, all the performances, podcasts, book launches, yoga classes, poetry readings, and other online events which have sustained us during the pandemic. And so as the situation changes, people have been thinking about ways we can extend this openness and innovation. And I think working with remote visitors is one way to bring some of that energy and a range of voices into changing classrooms. Thanks.
Thank you. Perfectly timed, to the second, in fact. Our next speaker is Sean Sutherland, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster. Sean, go. You started. Fantastic.
Yes, hello everyone. Hi, thanks for having me. And let me just push begin. You can see here what I've come to talk about, online writing days, which may be very, what I'm going to say was a revelation to me when one of my colleagues introduced it as a way of, as we heard someone say about 3 presentations back, how will you make visible your being there with and for your students? I'm a course leader for 2 MA courses at our university, our MA in TESOL and our MA in English language. And during this term, normally master's students would be finishing their dissertations, aiming for an end of August completion. And so normally they'd be coming in to see the supervisors, to use the library, to work with each other, to see me as the course leader. And of course, that's all gone now. So we've had, I think, very good successful for me, and feedback from the students that this has been very successful, setting up 1 day a week where we work online, we meaning whichever students want to participate, and then me. I'm there with a simple schedule like this, where as you can see, we gather in the morning and say hello and maybe set goals, or maybe just talk about the weather wherever people happen to be, because many of them have gone home to their home countries. And then we have 2 1.5-hour blocks for writing, as you see there, and then a final block at the end where people do as they will, write for as long as they want to. And the goal was to mimic the kind of experience that they might have if they came and did work in the library and could see their colleagues, their friends across the library, and that they might have a coffee break once in a while. And so they just go through as we see here. And as I wrote as course leader, as I wrote at the bottom there, as course leader, it also gives me a great chance to interact with them and do that being there that we just saw, right? To show them that I'm here to support them and provide minor, as I said here, minor questions. If it's something private or if it takes more time, we set up something else. But to talk about general issues, sometimes students will ask about things like the ethics process for their dissertations or what have you. So it gives me the chance to sort that out with them publicly so that everyone can take advantage of hearing the answers as necessary. Almost done, right? Really. So it just ends up looking like this sort of thing, or wait, I labeled it, right? Something like this, which, as you see there, students across the top, actual students smiling and laughing, having a good time, right? So it's, and everybody gave permission, by the way, for me to use this, all the people here. So happy students interacting with one another, and with, as you see, with another lecturer. I get lectures to, everybody's been great about volunteering to jump in and join us for the lunch break, for some of the lunch breaks, again, just to talk about the weather or to talk about particular things to do with research and writing. And so it helps promote that sense of community that they would be getting on site and that they're not getting now. And the good thing about this, taking it forward, is I guess we'll be doing things like this at our courses and our university at least. We'll be trying to, maybe not full days, but for undergraduate students, doing similar things, right? Having people come and gather, and then give them a task. Instead of it being a break time, give them a task, off they go to do the task, and then they gather back together to discuss with each other and with the module leader, the lecturer, with me, right? So that's a little thing that's working very well for us. Scheduled, organized writing sessions throughout the day, working for master's students in the summer, hoping to do similar things throughout the academic year as necessary. Great, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. That's really fantastic. And again, perfect timekeeping. Thank you so much. Our next speakers are Dr. Claudia Capaccioni, Senior Lecturer and Program Leader for English, and Dr. Hannah Grenham, Learning Development Tutor, both at Bishop Grosseteste University. So take it away, Claudia and Hannah.
Can you see my screen? Am I sharing?
We've got the end of your slideshow.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah. No, I need to go to the beginning. Oh, because I was trying before, wasn't I?
Yeah.
So, yeah, here we go. Okay.
Cool.
So as you can see, I'm here today with Hannah Graham, who is the tutor at the Centre for Learning for Excellent in Teaching, Learning and Teaching at BGU, and the expert that really helped me facilitating a more creative, soft skills-based approach to building this toolkit. I think that's why we think of it, to foster the MA students' positivity. So I want to start by saying that that word emergency in the title is simply to do with the way I actually felt at a certain point preparing the MA dissertation module as the module leader. I had prepared, plan A and B and C in terms of delivery of the module online. I did more and diverse activities. Most importantly, I thought about informal group tutorials that I called coffee breaks to keep in regular contact with the students. However, after the Easter break, it became quite clear to me that the MA students faced anxiety as they prepared to enter what I always expect to be the most exciting term, their dissertation. So they kept having, during these informal group tutorials, specific and recurring questions linked to the summer term. They wanted to know about accessing resources, library services, what can I choose to do for my dissertation if I can't access this or the other, particularly if they wanted to do archival research. So since the beginning of the lockdown, behind closed doors, we worked on securing added e-resources, prioritizing the MA or postgrad students overall, I should say, access to library services, but no clear timeline I could share with them. So there were limits to what I could answer. So I knew there was more to be done to show that we were listening and addressing their needs, specifically thinking about their summer term and the excitement that should give them. So I prepared online and teaching materials, as you can see in this slide, kind of highlighting more and more positive and proactive attitudes. And that's because I was trying to recreate what I always like to support, to facilitate as a tutor for my MA students. But as this third slide will show you, it just wasn't enough. I think some of the speakers have already said that at times some of the platforms we have thought about are not the ones that the students prefer. And as you can see from the thoughts, feelings and emotions expressed through this Padlet, that I have to say Hannah created and launched in our taught sessions, of which she was a guest. And that allowed anonymous expressions of how the students felt, clearly showed that we ought to think about the students' need in terms of motivation and resilience, soft skills we often expect the postgraduate students to have by the time they join us at this level. And therefore, with Hannah, we thought about building a digital creative toolkit of skills and poems inspired by a suggestion of Hannah, a book I didn't know, and it's called The Emergency Poet, an Anti-Stress Poetry Anthology by Deborah Ulmer. And that was a very good idea, I thought. But I leave it to Hannah to explain a little bit more about what we did, and we're doing, actually, I should say. Sorry.
Thank you, Claudia. If you could just move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, what I wanted to do in this session was to normalise without kind of trivialising what the students were experiencing. We know that soft skills are an important part of being a researcher, and so I really kind of wanted to sort of dig into that. If you could go to the next slide, please, Claudia. I want to kind of talk a little bit about how we actually did that. So I came up with this idea of the kind of the A.
Hannah, can you cut your video?
Of research, so adaptability, bounceability, so resilience, and communication, which I think we make sure of characteristics or qualities, but we wanted
1 minute,
to as skills which could be practiced and learned and honed. And so we talked through what these meant, how to do them, and why they were important, particularly in the context of the current situation. And some of the things that we tried to emphasize were the extracurricular. Yes. Yeah, there we go.
Fantastic.
Okay. So what we wanted to emphasize was the okay. So what I'll do is say, I'll pass back to Claudia to explain how we went about, or how she's kind of taking this further about developing these particular skills within the context of the MA dissertation students.
Okay, very quickly, Hannah, you've got like 30 seconds.
Well, so I think can kind of sum up where what taking this from the session that we did.
Okay, I'm sorry, the sound is really bad and we've had the time. I'm so sorry. What would be really cool is if you could record your voiceover again and maybe put the slides up on the repository. I'm really sorry about that. The sound kept breaking down. Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, I know the time is really grinding. Our last speaker in this session is Rebecca Gregory, Teaching Associate from the Institute of Medieval Research at the University of Nottingham. Rebecca. Okay, there you are. Yeah. Go.
Okay, can you see my starting slide and can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okie dokie. So this presentation is going to be a little bit different, I think, in that the project I'm talking about, Applied English, actually predates the pandemic. So we've had the luxury of time in developing the ideas that I'll be showing you. And they are more long-term ideas rather than quick fixes, I'm afraid. And we've also been working exclusively on distance learning programs. So about 2 years ago, our team at Nottingham was given funding to redesign our distance master's courses from the bottom up. So initially with a focus, of course, on teaching English, but with a view in the longer term to implications for teaching outside our own specialisms. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the scheme and pull out some of the information about assessment in particular, in the hope that it might be useful to you. So rather than beginning with what we'd expect from an on-campus master's programme, we started instead from a set of principles about what we wanted our programmes to be. So we wanted them to be multimodal, making appropriate use of various media and learning technologies, permeable, with students able to immerse themselves in the programme in a way that works for them, personalised and responsive to students' interests with opportunities for customised directions in curriculum and assessment. And we wanted them to be textured and contextually connected. So with opportunities for placements, workplace settings and other life experience to feed into the students' learning and assessment. Now, having a set of principles isn't quite the same as implementing them, but I'll show you what we came up with. So instead of traditional modules, our students will take pods. So these are smaller units of study which can be combined in a variety of ways with very nearly free choice. And in each 60 credit phase of study, students take 6 pods, as in this example. So this particular one might be a student who's primarily interested in literature, but they're also exploring aspects outside their initial area of interest. And for each 6-pod phase, students submit a portfolio of work for assessment. So that portfolio can consist of traditional essays or of more applied forms of work, such as lesson plans, blog posts, web or app design, videos. I think you get the general idea. But of course, we also need to ensure academic rigour, especially where students have such freedom of choice. And for this purpose, we're using what we're calling expertise indicators. So very much like traditional learning outcomes, but designed to ensure that a student leaves a pod with a set of measurable skills that are specific to that subdiscipline. So each pod has 3 expertise indicators, all of which must be demonstrated in their portfolio submission. So, for example, the expertise indicators for surnames and identities look like this. And in some cases, a student might be able to submit work that covers indicators from more than one pod. So something like a literary linguistic analysis of a Gothic text. And once the portfolio is submitted, the student moves on to 6 more pods, building on interests they're developing or trying something new. And this particular student has opted for more medieval pods in their second phase. So the process looks something like this, with 3 phases of study. And in the final phase, the student has the opportunity, if they wish, to do an extended project. So either a traditional dissertation or something more applied, such as a syllabus or an addition of a text, for example. So this is where we are, with a flexible programme and the ability for students to specialise as they go. And their final named degree is decided based on the topics that they've studied. So this works for our distance learning situations, but we've also created tools and resources along the way that can be used in blended environments too. So we've worked on asynchronous activities and interactivity, not assuming equal access to equipment and internet from our students, as several people have talked about already. We've got innovative assessment design, which could be used in other environments as well. And we're supporting colleagues in adapting their teaching for the months ahead, showcasing what we've learned about Office 365 software, in particular for synchronous and asynchronous teaching. And in the longer term, we hope that the scheme might be adaptable to on-campus courses with greater flexibility for students from a more diverse range of backgrounds and professional contexts. And I suppose time will tell with that. But in general, the whole team would be really happy to talk to colleagues wherever you're from about how we might be able to help either with assessment design or with other aspects of using different learning technologies to make our learning and our teaching more flexible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becca. Perfect time again. Okay, folks, that was a really great session. People from across the discipline, language, literature, creative writing, and now we're going to have our break and we're going to restart at 12:20, everybody. Okay, thank you very much. Get away from your computers for 10 minutes. Okay, bye-bye. Au revoir.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Doug.
I was just looking at my phone and I saw you waving, and I thought, oh, Bob's lonely.
No, I've got Katie and Becky.
All right, oh, I can't see them on this mommy screen.
Okay.
Spectral.
I thought you were just waving for attention. Like, oh, look at me.
Is that a white flag, Bob?
Okay. Well, we're nearly ready to go. Gail, how can we support you? Someone said something?
It was me, Rosie. I just said it's all gone really well. I can't believe we've got through so many people so fast.
Everyone's been really great.
Yeah, amazing.
We're all reeling a bit, but that's in a good way.
But I think that's, I mean, I like it like that, because there's all those things are full of really great ideas. Like I know Sean's just come back, but I'd never thought of having an online writing day. That's just such a great idea. And
I just noticed that in the chat, the last several comments have all gone only to panelists, and some of them look like they're more general.
Okay, yeah, got it.
That's my fault for sending a thing to panelists about noise. Sorry.
No, it's not your fault, Doug. We've got it set so that people can only message the panelists rather than the whole group. So it's not your fault.
No, that's a relief.
But everyone's been using the chat.
Sorry, yeah, that my fault. We can the panelists, we can email, we can chat to all the attendees as well. Sorry, I realise I've just sent something to the panelists I meant to send to everybody. I'll do it again.
Yeah, keep sending them that guide.
Yeah,
keep sending that link. I think it's I, like you said earlier on, Rosie, I don't it's hardly dated at all, and because the pedagogy is so sound behind it, you know.
Yeah, well, thank you. And Ben, I hope he's hearing that too. And maybe there are some other people who took part in it who might even be on this call, you know, in terms of the participants. But I mean, it's a surprise to us. It suddenly seems to have found its moment.
Yeah, I'm speaking purely personally, is that when I was tasked to do a course for my school as a model, I didn't know where to begin. And it was reading Ben's 10 tips in that thing, and then your thing on assessment in that. And I thought, okay, this is actually doable. So that's, Ben, that's why I kept hassling you to come and talk, because I thought your two things were so useful, and they broke my fear, if that makes sense.
I strongly agree with that.
Right.
Strongly.
Good, thanks.
So, thank you.
I'll repost to everybody.
Please.
Thanks for persisting, Bob. I've really enjoyed the session as a whole, really well organized, and it's been brilliant.
Well, I don't want to get too cheesy, but it's a kind of disciplinary thing, and I think everyone's been really great. People have been volunteering and sticking to time and being really clear about things and bringing ideas. I think it's kind of us working together in a really great way, and it's a real pleasure to be involved. Okay, so I should stop. That sounds like we should maybe start the next session.
Yeah. So if all the panelists want to reveal themselves to our audience, that would be kind of nice, so people know who they're listening to, and it's very nice for me to know who I'm speaking to as well. Thank you very much. So we've got a range of general questions that have come up, and there might be more coming through on the Q&A later. So I'll go through the ones that I've got, and Bob, if we've got time, if you can feed through the new ones that come through as well, that would be fantastic. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you've had a good coffee break. The sun is out here in London, if nowhere else. I think one of the things that's come through this morning is we've got an awful lot of experience to draw on, and that the new things we're doing are very rapidly becoming an experience that we can all share. It's been particularly interesting, I think, to hear initially from Andy from the OU, who are very used to doing this kind of online having this online experience, which is very new to lots of us. And I wondered if we could kick off this session, Andy, by your sharing with us some of the benefits and advantages of online teaching and learning, which I think we've heard from lots of people already. But from your perspective as a well-practiced person doing online teaching, what would you want to add to what we've heard today?
I guess in terms of benefits and advantages, the simple one is that it's enabled us to reach more students more effectively. That's perhaps a little different if you're looking at moving to online kind of relatively quickly by September. You may well be trying to reach the same students. And I suppose I just ought to follow with a word of caution. We've heard quite a bit about accessibility today. And it's been my experience in online classes that often students are joining in difficult contexts. They're not necessarily in a quiet study space. They may well be accessing it through their mobile phone or whatever. So you need to think about how you're going to engage them and make allowances for the fact that they may not be entering into discussion directly and so on. So that was a rather qualified advantage. It makes learning more accessible to students, but at the same time, there are some real issues around accessibility. And students will tend to contribute to discussion by the text chat by preference. I've found, and I can see one or two people nodding, that may be a more common experience than just mine. I always do fear that this is just a response to my teaching, that I drive everyone into silence. But you can, as a lecturer, as a seminar tutor, start to engage with those text comments, start to bring them into the discussion. I haven't seen all the papers today, but I saw a couple of people commenting on that earlier today. How do you use students' kind of conversation forums to drive discussion further? And that can be effective. So yes, I'll stop speaking there. Other people will have things to say about this.
Okay, thank you. We have heard, I think, about some of the advantages. I suppose I want to think about some of the questions that have come up around possible disadvantages or things we need to mitigate. Andrea talked a lot about accessibility, which is really helpful and really good to think about. But one of the people commenting on the chat was asking about the particular resources we might need. Are there any additional financial resources that we might need to draw in order to mitigate against disability, against access issues? Has anybody had any experience of working in those areas, and would they have resources they'd like to recommend? If you want to unmute yourselves or put your hands up to let me know who wants to answer that one. Andrea, do you want to? Oh, Rebecca, please, first, and then Katrina.
Yeah, I can only give a very kind of narrow piece of this puzzle, I think, which is thinking particularly about online access to scans and PDFs and things like that, which Andrea was obviously talking about. And I would say really cultivate your relationship with your library team and with anyone who specifically works on accessibility, particularly if you are doing anything new. Or you need huge amounts of resource at once. Make sure people know that and they will be able to help you. It sounds like a really common sense thing, but actually, certainly in my experience, people aren't always aware of the channels of communication they have, and to actually make life easier for the people doing the scanning and creating your resources for you. So that's, yeah, just one thing in my experience.
Katrina, did you have something to add to that?
I guess it was just a quick reflection on the need for training to some extent, as well as software. So captioning software, make sure whatever video technology you're using has the ability to auto-generate captions or subtitles or transcripts. And it depends what tool you're using, whether there is one built in or not. And the other thing was just around training, thinking about, so I know very well at Royal Holloway, we're going to have to do quite substantial training in some areas to update staff on the latest accessibility requirements and making all their resources accessible to a wide variety of users.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that the point about time is really important too, because obviously we're feeling quite time pressured, but all the guys at our work in terms of resources are going to be facing demands from right across the institution. So the more we can do to help them manage their time over the summer, the better. There was also a set of questions about community building, cohort building as well. Obviously, we've been thinking a lot this morning about more academic issues of what we can provide, but in terms of the social issues too, if students are in second or third year, they're already building their cohort, but particularly I think around first years, coming in fresh, coming into this situation which none of us had anticipated. Is there anything that we can do as lecturers to help them build that cohort to, and also I think to set not just academic expectations, but expectations around sociability, around the sorts of personal experiences they might be able to anticipate. Andrea.
Particularly for level 4 incoming students, icebreakers are so much more important than they have ever been in online contexts, and that also helps students ease into the technology as well. So you getting them to adjust to the technology and practice with the new tools that they might be engaging with in ways that also at the same time help them get to know each other. Can be a really nice combination of kind of fun, no pressure, light-hearted tasks, like getting students to collaboratively draw on Jamboard or whatever kind of tools that you're working with, and just getting them to get to know each other. But also students can be encouraged to kind of build up a starter yearbook of themselves, just introducing themselves with a photo and just a bit about who they are, so that there is an established kind of sense of community, and so that when people speak, even if they haven't got their camera on, someone can go and look up who that person is to get a sense of kind of connection and collaboration. Those are just little things that are actually pretty doable in an online learning context and can compensate a little bit for that lack of kind of sociability face to face.
That's a lovely idea. Sophie, and then Rosie. Hi, yes, I would absolutely second that. I think having a very structured induction process that introduces people to the technology at the same time as the subject that they're studying is really important. And then to go back to what Rosie was saying, I think assessing can come into this too, because you know, people are normally horrified when I say that on our MA now we have over 100 students in our cohort, which is, you know, sounds absolutely crazy and sounds like it's a MOOC, but in fact we make it work because we break them into smaller groups and they really get to know one another. And we also assess for participation. So there's a kind of pass-fail element to students participating in discussion forums, because discussion forums are notoriously difficult to make work online, unless I found you actually make it part of the assessment, and then by magic people really engage with it. It's amazing how that happens. So in fact we do that in the first module and then we don't have to do it after that, because everybody's become very comfortable with using the technology and talking together, and so that works very well for us. So think about maybe assessing participation too. Thank you. Rosie.
Yeah, I would actually echo some of what Sophie just said. I know at Wolverhampton, I mean, my courses were third year, but the students had done stuff Ben had been involved in was at first year. So again, they'd become used to doing stuff online. So it didn't. Again, I said there was something about that first year introduction that is now going to happen for all of us. Also, another thing about building community, I mean, I think you really can build community in an online space in a very real way that can work alongside your synchronous hours or whenever face-to-face returns. So my discussion forums, I would have a discussion forum for each activity that was going to be assessed, and the students knew that that was where they posted in relation to that activity. But I also would always have on a course, like my Victorians course, we'd always have a kind of almost off-topic discussion forum, which I'd make quite a playful space. So the students knew that they could post in there, and as long as it wasn't, you know, offensive, illegal, whatever, they could sort of say what they wanted. At best, they would post all sorts of interesting things related to the course. And would really own that space. And I'd make it a bit more fun by inviting the class to name the forum, and we'd have a little competition, and they come up with all sorts of kind of funny Victorian names for it, you know. And so again, make it something. If you make some things, give students ownership. It's not all about us. Give students the ownership that it becomes something that they want to be part of, and you create community.
Thank you very much. Ben?
Yes, I agree with all that, and I was just thinking back to the first year students coming in fresh, and the suggestion about icebreakers, very important. Also, I was thinking about a number of the speakers have talked about students' reluctance in some ways to show their faces, and in some ways to be empowered by not showing their faces. So I think certainly at this level, it would be very good for students to start developing textual relationships as well, maybe to show their faces when and if they feel it would be right. But we shouldn't perhaps necessarily expect them to come online and then reveal. And maybe, again, I was talking a little bit about, and someone else mentioned, group writing activities where people playfully are involved in maybe building a text together. It could be part of an icebreaker exercise, for example. And also, we used to, in terms of level 4 modules, we'd gradually introduce different types of activities as we move forward, quite simple ones in some ways. But for example, looking at a poem like William Blake and thinking about language and looking at the OED, which most of us have online, and getting them to think about the new, what happens when you take that same poem and read it with historical meanings. These are fairly simple building block type activities that don't involve too complex methods, and slowly feeding those into an early module can really help build that kind of community that the questioner was talking about.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure that's right, and I think also that idea of playing with the digital space to enable students to get more comfortable with using it for when it kind of counts in an assessment must be really helpful as well as getting them to learn to know each other. I suppose one of the things that's cropped up in the chat and the Q&A is thinking about the things that we're missing, the things that we kind of add on to the kind of core academic discipline. And one of those big things that we've all been thinking about a lot over recent years is employability, and the fact that because placements aren't going to be there in the same way anymore, what can we do you think, to compensate for that lack of a kind of employability strand in what we do? I mean, Shelley, you've talked a bit about the workshop, which is always a huge success. So that's one means of doing it. But I don't know if anybody wants to reflect on other ways in which we can build employability back into this digital space. I mean, Shelley, I don't know if you want to say something about how the students responded to, say a bit more about how students responded to that, and how you might take that workshop idea on and perhaps build it into the curriculum more effectively.
Yeah, so I think the thing that was really interesting about it was that we can go online and find information, and so can our students, right? There's lots of information about various kind of career paths kind of publicly available, but what that event did was to enable students to ask personal questions, small questions, and because they could ask in a really low stakes way, they could ask questions they thought were maybe stupid. So in a sense, it gave access to the sorts of information actually that's really hard to find online. To address your specific question, which is how do we kind of make that part of the curriculum? I mean, in my subject, in creative writing, I feel like we're very much linking with JT, what JT is doing, which is that you embed this kind of constant industry connection as a natural part of your academic work with the students. So I feel that's a pretty low-tech answer from me, which is that you get more people in. But the truth is, if you do get more people in, it does give students access to the kind of information they can't Google.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. JT and then Andrea.
Yeah, I was just going to say, briefly again, I think there's a way of thinking of these technologies as not just a means, but they are an opportunity in themselves for employability, that the skills in using them. And that was really clear, I think, working with external people who are, talking about the platforms that they use and in the publishing industry or whatever, other industries. And if we can take these things seriously for the students. And I know VLEs are kind of constrained and they're kind of walled gardens in that way, but thinking about other technologies that students might be using in their own part-time jobs and things and stuff, and if they can dovetail that into teaching, it seems good.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, and then I think Bob had a comment.
I think there are two things that we can do really effectively to kind of mitigate that loss of dedicated employability provision, although obviously a lot of our institutions have a lot of good online employability provision. But within courses, we can work harder to articulate and draw out the kinds of skills development that are embedded within the normal run of things anyway, the kind of nature of work that the students do, that they produce, get them reflecting on the way in which their skills are evolving. But also this is a brilliant opportunity to actually focus their attention on their digital skills and their growth of digital skills through this process: online collaboration, potential video editing and podcasting, and web accessibility awareness, and all of those kinds of things that they actually will be developing at a much quicker pace than they otherwise might have been, and actually make that a reflective part of their journey.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think Bob and then Claudia.
I was going to feed in a question from the Q&A that wasn't relevant to this. Sorry.
Okay, Claudia, do you want to? Can you unmute?
So used to, sorry. I was going to say, actually, to follow on to what Andrea is saying, I know I was thinking about soft skills and creativity for the MA with the presentation, but we do have a second year English at Work, it's called module, and that's what happened. Time-wise, as it happened, we had just done a risk assessment session to think about what happens if, and then the reality became that they had to go into plan A, B, or C. And what we realized that particularly 3 projects that is like a project-based type of employability module, so based on skills and what they want to do, really. And what happened was that in order to make 3 particular projects that we thought would be very challenging for them to do, because they were about events, planning, and an allotment type of project, what they did was the students were good enough to move on to more digital tools, and they produced some of the best postcards we ever had, and they learned how to work with the support staff for university more than they would normally. So the results are actually amazing, and we have an online anthology now that is going to be launched. It hasn't yet been launched because of the exam boards, but so yeah, so it was nice to see that there were ways in which what we've often prepared or produced in terms of thinking about what to do, some resilience really doesn't work. When it kicked through, it worked, and it was really interesting to see how some of the students are very resourceful in that way, and raised themselves, and did well, very well actually, yeah.
Thank you. I think, they are incredibly resourceful as a generation, and probably perhaps more resourceful than many of us are in the digital space, which I guess we shouldn't forget. Bob, did you want to feed through some questions that have just come in?
Yeah, so there are some different questions coming in. One from, which picking up on things we talked about, one from Ross Dawson about, could we have some more examples of how you assess things online from people? And Rosie's replied to that in the chat too, but perhaps we could have some conversations about that. Again, also some more examples of ice-breaking exercises. And there's also discussion about chunking, about lecture lengths. So maybe we could air some of those things. Would it be easier? So perhaps if Catriona and Alice want to talk about lecture chunking briefly. So maybe Kat first and then Alice. Is that right, Gail?
Yeah, of course.
Hi, so I briefly replied to Alice with just a link about attention spans related to online teaching in the chat. In addition to reasons of sort of concentration, the other reason why chunking is really kind of advantageous is for those who don't necessarily have the same access to technology. Streaming shorter videos is advantageous because the network requirements are much lower, so there's an accessibility element from sort of that direction as well. And largely those people who sort of would be needing to access on a lower internet connection or lower bandwidth will also be people often from protected groups around accessibilities, whether those are disabled individuals or individuals who are shielding, or whether they might be from the BME or BAME or minoritized groups from those kind of communities as well, and those with specific learning difficulties. So that's, I guess, some more reasons why chunking could be a good idea. Also, these are undertaken asynchronously as well. You can insert kind of little activities and learning checks between each chunk, kind of keep the engagement and things like that. But I'm sure other people have opinions or thoughts on that as well. So I'll shut up.
So Alice, shall we hear from you next?
Sorry?
Alice, please go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry, I didn't quite hear. Yeah, I was just thinking about chunking a bit. So I guess one of the things I was thinking about was that the way that we've tended to think about chunking has been about attention spans, and that was the starting point. And for me, one of the things that I wanted to think about in terms of the lecture as a unit was whether there were things that we wanted to try and preserve from that longer, more sustained route through some material. So there are things about the lecture which can help students to see an argument developing that they might not be able to see in other kinds of contexts. And in the chat, I'd mentioned the piece which I think people might have seen by Catherine Hales from a few years ago, where she talks about hyperattention and deep attention, and she talks about the idea that we tend to think of literary studies particularly as being focused on developing deep attention, but that we should also not disregard hyperattention at all, and it's really valuable, and we should be looking for ways that we can develop that kind of attention too in our students. But the lecture seems to me in its current form to tend to be more about that kind of deep attention, and so I think that there's definitely something to be said for a balance between the two. But it might be that there are ways that we can think about kind of trying to do both of those two things at once. So what I've tended to do in the past has been to record a lecture with audio only and to have the video option as well, so that if students have bandwidth problems, they can just download the audio. So I've had a lot of students who prefer to listen to that while they're looking after their kids, or a student who is a lorry driver memorably used to listen to the lectures when he was driving. And so the audio only option is really good for accessibility issues, I've found. But the problem with that is that you can't closed caption it. So what I've been thinking about more recently has been using the chapters function in YouTube, so that you can put staging points, so that you can chunk up something which is a larger whole into smaller sections, and therefore it's easier for people to find a starting and finishing point within a larger whole, so you don't necessarily sacrifice the big sweep, but you've also got chunks inside it. So yeah, like internal chunking maybe might be something to think about, it because that allows you maybe to do both things at once.
Thank you. I think Sophie, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to come in there and say as well that this idea about attention and deep attention, because I think sometimes we can forget that not everything has to be online all the time. So in fact, within the rhythm of online learning, which can be much more elongated than we might be used to, we can ask people to engage in their own activities on their own independently, and then come back and share them, and that can be the space where that deep attention can happen. So I mean, it's maybe stating the obvious, but I think sometimes we just forget that.
That's a really useful reminder, because actually most of our students will still be spending their time by themselves, hopefully with a book or with their own screen, giving that deep attention to the text. And I suppose one of the challenges for next year is going to be how we translate their individual deep attention into something that can be shared in this kind of spaces that we're used to having in sort of face-to-face contact and conversations in. I think a couple of people raised the question of terminology as well, and that face-to-face perhaps elevates that mode of teaching into the ideal mode of teaching, and the fact that if we have something else, it is necessarily a lesser thing. I don't know if you have any thoughts about the terminology we might use, whether online or sorry, on campus might be better because it's a kind of more of an equivalent to online. Do you have any thoughts about how we kind of I suppose mitigate against a sense that students might feel they're having a lesser experience because it's an online one? Someone? I suppose it's been a frustrating part of the kind of newspaper discussion about next year, is that students are only getting face-to-face, so it's not worth paying for, it's not worth turning up for. But of course we know that just as much, if not more, effort will go into next year's teaching than it's ever done before. So is there a way of having that discussion with students? Alice?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's something slightly awkward about that for us, because we've for 10 years we've offered a face-to-face on-campus course and a very similar blended learning course through partner colleges, but the tuition fee has been slightly lower for the blended learning course, so it's a bit of an awkward situation yeah, to negotiate that now. But so yeah, I don't have a solution, but yeah, I'm really conscious of that.
JT, thank you.
I guess my immediate thought though is this is a long-term thing that we've had to deal with in English, because people are always talking about contact hours anyway, and that the emphasis that we put on independent learning, I think, really comes into a different kind of relationship here. It's the same emphasis.
Yeah. Sophie?
I think I would agree, and I think this is a moment where we can really start, and it's going to take a long time, but start to really talk about this and actually engage students in talking about it, because, you know, this idea that online is the sort of deficit model, I think we've heard this morning how that just isn't true, and that there are so many wonderful opportunities in terms of this kind of mode, and that we should think of learning as this hybrid process anyway. So I think the more that we can actually ask students what they want and how they want to learn, because, you know, I'm convinced that so many of my students would never have been able to do an MA if they hadn't been able to do it in the way that, you know, we can offer it. And the more that we can get students on board with that, I think we can start to change the narrative, but it is going to take time. Yeah, and this is the sort of emergency discourse that we're hearing at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Rosie?
Yeah, I was just going to say, from my experience when I was an e-learning consultant and the stuff I'd done as a national teaching fellow, I mean, when I could visit different departments, and as I said, I went into a huge range of different English departments, from top Russell Group to FE, combined, and everything in between. And that was interesting, because, you know, I would feel the resistance on occasions from some staff, not by no means all, but it was really, really interesting. And I wonder whether there is still an element of that there, and there's a kind of disciplinary thing that maybe English needs sometimes still to think about, and I'm not quite sure why English sometimes can be quite resistant to online teaching. I don't, again, there was a sort of interesting silence when you asked the question about, you know, how do we mitigate against it being seen as lesser, and I don't have any answers either. I guess there's something quite important about tone of us as tutors, and I can't know, you know, we've all got to take individual responsibility for this. If you go into your class and you kind of communicate that you think this is a lesser thing, well, that's exactly what your students are going to pick up. But I also recognise that maybe takes a certain level of confidence, basic confidence yourself, maybe in what you're going to do, in a sense of you feel okay enough about the technology or platforms you're using and what you're going to do. And of course, I totally get the anxiety and concern that many of us are experiencing in these new circumstances. So I think I'm also saying I don't have the answers, but I think there's something very important about our own tone, I suppose.
Yeah.
It comes back to sort of teacher presence and how we want to be as a teacher, lecturer, tutor, going into what is for now a new normal.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, if I could just kind of observe briefly that I think students actually have quite mixed views on this when it comes to it. If I ask students at the Open University whether they prefer face-to-face teaching or online teaching, most still say that they'd much rather attend a face-to-face class. They like that contact, they like the social element of it. Some with particular accessibility issues will say that they prefer online. But when it actually comes to attendance, you find that you travel kind of 100 miles to deliver a class and maybe half a dozen people attend. If you deliver the same thing online, 40, 50 students attend. I think there is a sense there that there are advantages to online, which might just be about convenience in some ways, but those to some extent in practice outweigh anyone's reservations about this not being face-to-face teaching. So there is a split there between people's stated views on the relationship between online and face-to-face and what they actually do in practice. I'm involved in a scholarship project on this, looking at attendance across the OU and attainment and things like that, which students do tend to attend one or the other, and how does that work out over time. So I might have more to say about that one day.
Okay, thank you. I think it's about, I mean, it's probably about what you and Rosie are both saying about being confident about what we're offering, being able to speak to advantages, as Sophie's already said, and actually having this discussion where we can share those advantages as well as the issues we're worried about is incredibly helpful, and will give us all that much more confidence in the autumn, I think. Ben, did you want to respond to that particular question as well?
Yes, I just kind of wanted to echo Andy in a way, because I think many of my students are not as resistant as perhaps some members of staff are to the online side of the course delivery. And in fact, some of my students even expressed that they actually preferred the online seminar because of the text features that allowed them to keep a record of their discussion to go back to, and that sort of thing. So there are actually advantages from a student's point of view to online learning. I think, you know, a lot of my students are living in kind of difficult situations. Many are mature students. It's a low-income kind of area in which Wolverhampton is set. A lot of students see university as a place to kind of escape the home life. Most people are living at home. So it's not so much even about going to class, but it's the social experience of going onto campus, using the library and those sorts of things. And that's going to be harder to reconcile than perhaps the teaching itself for individual students. But the online element, I think, is actually a space which we can exploit in a good sort of way, and especially if we listen a little bit closer to what our students are getting out of it.
Thank you. I think, Alice, one quick comment, and we've got 2 more questions before we finish.
Yeah, I really wanted to affirm that the experience that I've had from my students has been that the students who've moved from a face-to-face experience to a wholly online experience have said that one of the really big challenges that they've had is in motivation. So where they've previously only had to make the decision to get out of the door and physically get onto campus for a day of activities, now if we've got a selection of things for them to do online, every single one of those is a separate decision where they have to motivate themselves and find the space within a busy home often to actually engage with that material. So it's a real challenge, and I don't know how easy it is to try and think about comparing the two, because of course there are advantages and disadvantages, but it's such a challenge for them to find the space and the time to commit to studies.
But that's really helpful, actually. It's really useful to have some pointers which will enable us to articulate the differences and the different possibilities of both those resources and both those means of teaching. So I think if we're just treating one as a kind of simple alternative to the other, that means we're kind of underplaying the possibilities, but also the difficulties of the decisions they're going to have to make. So that's really, really, really helpful. 2 final questions before we finish. One is, can we just have a quick fire response to the question of what are really good icebreakers that we can use online? Quick show of hands if you've got an idea you want to share just quickly. Sophie?
Yes, very, very simply, for creative writing students, a fantastic thing is have a poem or a piece of text set up in a Google Doc, use it to create an online workshop space, and ask students to start commenting on that. They get used to the technology, they get used to using that, and then they can start to use that Google Doc format to share feedback on their own work. So that would be my #1 tip.
Thanks. Anybody else? Okay, we can put ideas through on the repository afterwards. I think one of the other things that I've been very aware of in my own institution, which is also where Shelley is that over the summer we're going to be taking on an awful lot of work in putting all of our modules and courses online. And for those of you who are already experienced in moving things online, do you have any tips about how to manage that workload, how to make it just simply more manageable as we approach this summer, and as we get used to this new blended way of learning. Please have an answer for this one. Sophie, thank you.
Sorry to come in again, but just I put together a guide for people at Teesside. It's a kind of model of 3 audits that you can do. So thinking about your model, 3 audits, who, what, how. I've linked to it from my blog. I just really love people's feedback on whether they think it's helpful. So that would be my offer.
Okay, thank you very much. I suppose I'd also say personally, as a head of school, if you're not in that position, talk to your heads of school, talk to your heads of department about what's going on, talk to them about the resources you think you might need in order to help students to access things, to put things yourself online. I think we're all moving into largely uncharted territories, and if we don't know about the resources that you're going to need, we can't make space for those and try and find some money for them. So keep talking, I think. Bob, did you want to add anything else before we finish?
Just Claudia's hand is up.
Oh, sorry. I thought, Claudia, is that an old raised hand or is that a new raised hand?
New one, sorry.
Okay.
So, which is a little bit linked to what you were asking about language, because I think also to maybe choose together a better way of thinking about how to describe what we're doing now or from now onwards is positivity, to give them a positive, so going back to motivation. So what I would say in terms of working in our English departments, what I'm trying to do my best with is a team approach as much as possible. So Hannah was Andrea, I think, first of all, was talking about consistency and how important it is for those of us in the team who are much more confident with digital skills and tools, actually not to go too far ahead or to be a little bit too much of a star about it, so that everyone else can kind of train and build up the skills so that we can offer a consistent, clear and positive learning experience. I really think maybe it's one of the things that maybe you couldn't hear it, and I can't remember whether Hannah was supposed to say it or not, because it's a bit, I guess, a bit going over the transparency of the institutions, but something that really made the anxiety level of the MA students going really, really high was the ways in which executive leadership was talking about all students, all taught courses, without actually tackling the fact that MA students had a third term, so that it wouldn't be something that he finishes with exam boards and then coming back in September, that they had a summer to think about, how to change their views about what to do with their research. And that language that was so general and not addressing the diversity of learning experiences was really damaging their confidence and their motivation and the level of anxiety. That was really when the emergency in my
That's really interesting. Yeah. I think, I mean, just to politicize a bit, I suppose one of the things that the pandemic has shown us is actually that the answers lie in the local and in local management of things, and in speaking to and recognising, as you say, the complexity of a local situation and local needs. So it's actually in departments as well as referring to the broader institutional and capacities and languages that we're going to find those solutions. Bob, do you just want to have a quick word before we wrap up?
No, leave it to you.
Okay, all right. Well, it just leaves it to me then to say thank you very much to all our panellists, some of whom you can see here on screen, for keeping time, for giving us such inspired ideas actually, and also creating a sense of comfort around the possibilities and the fact that those possibilities are achievable with good collegial support such as we've had today. So thank you very much indeed. And thanks to everyone. We've still got 100 participants signed in. Thanks very much everyone for joining us today. And just a reminder that the repository is going to be available in perpetuity across the summer. So do feed things through to Rebecca Fisher at the English Association, whom you can see nodding there. And we'll keep that repository going and ideally keep a conversation going between ourselves over the summer as we move through to a new normal, as we have to say these days. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's been great to be in touch with all of you.
Thank you. It's been lovely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so